The typewriter keys struck the paper with mechanical precision, each letter forming part of an endless stream of documentation that flowed through the police department like a quiet river of human experience. Detective Raymond Walsh had been typing reports for 23 years, and his fingers moved across the keyboard with the unconscious rhythm of someone who had long ago internalized the particular language that police work required. Report number 874521 began like all the others, with the basic framework that transformed chaotic human experience into something that could be filed, referenced and understood by anyone who might need to review it years or even decades later. Date of incident: October 15, 1987. Time of initial call: 2:47 a.m. Responding officers: Walsh, R. and Martinez. EN nature of complaint: suspicious person reported in vicinity of Riverside Elementary School. The report form itself was a marvel of bureaucratic efficiency, its boxes and lines designed to capture the essential elements of any incident while leaving space for the narrative details that gave each case its particular character. Detective Walsh had filled out thousands of these forms, each one representing a small moment in the vast ongoing story of the city's life, each one adding another layer to the accumulated knowledge that the department maintained about the community it served. The suspicious person in question had turned out to be Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez, a substitute teacher who had been walking through the neighborhood at an unusual hour because she suffered from insomnia and found that gentle exercise helped her manage the condition. The neighbor who had called in the complaint had acted from genuine concern, noting that someone was walking slowly around the school grounds at a time when such behavior might indicate criminal intent. Detective Walsh typed these details with the same methodical care he brought to every report, understanding that the person who read this file in the future would need to understand not just what had happened but why the incident had unfolded as it did. Mrs. Vasquez had been carrying a small flashlight to navigate the uneven sidewalks, which had appeared suspicious to the neighbor watching from a darkened window. She had been walking slowly because her arthritis made quick movement painful, particularly during the cool, early morning hours. The investigation had required only a brief conversation to resolve, but Detective Walsh documented it as thoroughly as he would a major crime, understanding that even simple incidents could provide valuable information about neighborhood patterns and community concerns. Mrs. Vasquez had been grateful for the police response, noting that it demonstrated the department's commitment to school safety, while the neighbor who had made the call had expressed appreciation for the quick and professional handling of her concerns. Report number 874522 documented a noise complaint from the apartment complex on Oak Street, where residents had been disturbed by what they described as loud banging and shouting. Coming from Unit 14B, Officer Martinez had responded to find that the disturbance was caused by Mr. James Patterson, a night shift worker who had been attempting to repair a malfunctioning washing machine that had begun making violent shaking noises during its spin cycle. The report detailed the mechanical problem that had caused the disturbance, noting that Mr. Patterson had been trying to prevent the machine from walking across his laundry room floor while also attempting to muffle the noise to avoid disturbing his neighbors. His efforts had created even more noise, leading to the complaint that brought police to the scene. Officer Martinez had helped Mr. Patterson disconnect the machine and had provided information about appliance repair services that offered emergency after-hours assistance. These seemingly minor incidents formed the vast majority of police work. Detective Walsh reflected as he continued typing. The dramatic crimes that captured public attention represented only a small fraction of the calls that officers responded to each day. Most police work involved exactly this kind of careful documentation of ordinary human problems that had temporarily exceeded the normal. Mechanisms of Community Self-Regulation, report number 874523, described a vehicle accident in the parking lot of Miller's hardware store, where Mrs. Dorothy Kim had backed her 1982 Honda Civic into a light pole while attempting to navigate around a delivery truck that was blocking her usual path to the exit. The collision had caused minor damage to both the vehicle and the light pole, but Mrs. Kim had been upset and disoriented. Leading store employees to call police for assistance, Officer Rodriguez had responded to the call, conducting the standard investigation required for any vehicle accident while also providing the emotional support that Mrs. Kim needed to regain her composure. The report documented the specific sequence of events that had led to the collision, the extent of the damage to both the vehicle and the light pole, and the arrangements that had been made for repairs and insurance claims. More importantly, the report included details about Mrs. Kim's state of mind and the factors that had contributed to the accident. She was 79 years old and had been driving for more than 50 years without a major incident, but recent changes in her vision had made her less confident behind the wheel. The delivery truck had forced her to navigate an unfamiliar path through the parking lot, creating a situation that exceeded her comfort level and led to the minor collision. Officer Rodriguez had recognized that Mrs. Kim's distress went beyond the immediate inconvenience of the accident to encompass larger concerns about her ability to maintain her independence as she aged. His report included recommendations for follow-up resources, including information about vision testing and driving assessment programs specifically designed for elderly drivers who wanted to continue driving safely. The report also documented Officer Rodriguez's conversation with the delivery driver, who had not realized that his truck was blocking the normal traffic flow through the parking lot. This led to a discussion with store management about establishing clear guidelines for delivery scheduling and truck placement to prevent similar incidents in the future. Detective Walsh found satisfaction in this kind of comprehensive documentation, the way it captured not just the immediate facts of an incident, but the broader context that made those facts meaningful. These reports served as a kind of institutional memory, preserving lessons learned and insights gained that could benefit future officers dealing with similar situations. Report number 874524. Detailed a welfare check requested by the adult children of Mr. Harold Stevens, who lived alone in a small house on Maple Street and had not answered his phone for several days. Officer Chun had responded to the request, conducting a careful investigation that balanced respect for Mr. Stevens' privacy with legitimate concerns about his welfare. The report described Officer Chun's methodical approach to the welfare check, beginning with an examination of the exterior of the house for any signs of distress or unusual activity. She had noted that newspapers had accumulated on the front porch for 3 days, that mail was overflowing from the mailbox, and that the house appeared to be unoccupied despite Mr. Stevens' car being parked in the driveway. Officer Chun had contacted neighbors to gather additional information about Mr. Stevens' recent activities and normal routines. Mrs. Anderson from next door had reported that she had not seen Mr. Stevens for several days, which was unusual because he typically spent time working in his garden each morning. Mr. Rodriguez from across the street had mentioned that the house had been completely dark for the past 2 nights, even though Mr. Stevens normally kept lights on in the evening. After exhausting these preliminary steps, Officer Chun had contacted Mr. Stevens' emergency contact, his daughter Patricia, who lived in the neighboring county. Patricia had confirmed that she had been unable to reach her father and had been growing increasingly worried about his welfare. She had provided Officer Chun with permission to enter the house, if necessary, to check on her father's condition. The report documented Officer Chun's careful entry into the house, noting that she had found the front door unlocked and had called out repeatedly before entering. She had discovered Mr. Stevens in his bedroom, where he had apparently suffered a heart attack several days earlier. The report included details about the condition of the scene, the apparent timeline of events, and the steps taken to notify appropriate authorities and family members. Officer Chun had also documented her observations about Mr. Stevens' living situation, noting that the house was clean and well maintained, that there were no signs of struggle or foul play, and that prescription medications found on his bedside table suggested he had been managing several chronic health conditions. This information had proven valuable for the medical examiner's investigation and had provided comfort to Mr. Stevens' family, who had been worried that he might have suffered before his death. The report concluded with documentation of Officer Chin's follow-up activities, including her assistance with notifying other family members, her coordination with funeral home staff, and her efforts to secure the house until family members could take responsibility for Mr. Stevens' possessions. She had also provided information to the family about resources for grief counseling and estate management. Detective Walsh recognized the importance of this kind of thorough documentation in cases involving death, understanding that families often needed detailed information about their loved ones' final days, and that any gaps in the official record could create unnecessary doubt or distress. Officer Chun's careful attention to detail had helped ensure that Mr. Stevens' family could focus on their grief rather than worrying about unanswered questions. Report number 874525 described a domestic disturbance call that had required delicate handling and extensive documentation. The incident had occurred at the Morrison household on Pine Street, where neighbors had reported hearing loud arguing and what sounded like furniture being moved or thrown. Officer Walsh and Officer Martinez had responded to the call, finding a situation that required both law enforcement skills and careful attention to family dynamics. The argument had been between Mr. Robert Morrison and his teenage son David, who had been struggling with the transition from high school to adult responsibilities, and had been expressing his frustration through increasingly confrontational behavior. The report documented the officer's initial assessment of the situation, noting that while the argument had been loud and emotionally intense, there were no signs of physical violence or immediate danger to anyone involved. Both father and son had been upset and angry, but they had been willing to speak with the officers and work toward a resolution of their immediate conflict. Officer Walsh had interviewed Mr. Morrison separately, learning that the argument had begun over David's failure to find employment despite having graduated from high school 3 months earlier. Mr. Morrison was frustrated by what he perceived as his son's lack of motivation and worried about David's future prospects in an increasingly competitive job market. Officer Martinez had spoken with David, discovering that the young man was overwhelmed by the prospect of transitioning to adult life and was struggling with depression that he had not shared with his family. David had been applying for jobs but had been discouraged by repeated rejections and had begun to doubt his ability to succeed in the working world. The report included detailed documentation of the officers' efforts to help the family develop strategies for addressing their underlying conflicts rather than simply stopping the immediate disturbance. They had provided information about job counseling services available through the State Employment Office and had connected David with information about mental health resources specifically designed for young adults dealing with transition-related stress. More importantly, the officers had helped father and son understand each other's perspectives and develop better communication strategies for addressing their ongoing concerns. Mr. Morrison had agreed to be more patient and supportive while David worked through his job search. While David had committed to being more open about his struggles and more proactive about seeking help when he needed it. The report documented several follow-up contacts with the Morrison family, noting that David had eventually found employment at a local manufacturing plant and that the family's communication had improved significantly. Officer Walsh had included this follow-up information because it demonstrated the value of addressing underlying causes rather than simply responding to immediate symptoms. Report number 874526 dealt with a shoplifting incident at Westfield Department Store, where security personnel had detained Mrs. Angela Foster, a 43-year-old mother of two, for attempting to leave the store without paying for a small toy and a package of children's socks. The incident had required careful handling because Mrs. Foster was clearly distressed and embarrassed by her situation. Detective Johnson had responded to the call, conducting a thorough investigation that revealed the complex circumstances behind Mrs. Foster's actions. She had been shopping for her children's Christmas presents with a limited budget and had become overwhelmed by the pressure to provide gifts that would meet her children's expectations while staying within her financial constraints. The report documented Detective Johnson's discovery that Mrs. Foster had been experiencing significant financial stress since her husband had been laid off from his job at the local factory 2 months earlier. The family had been managing on unemployment benefits and Mrs. Foster's part-time income from a retail job. But the approaching holiday season had created additional pressure that she had been struggling to handle. Mrs. Foster had explained to Detective Johnson that she had intended to pay for the items, but had become confused and distracted while calculating whether she had enough money to cover all of her planned purchases. She had put the toy and socks in her purse while considering what to remove from her shopping cart and had forgotten about them when she decided to leave the store and return when she had a clearer sense of her budget. The report included documentation of Detective Johnson's conversation with store security, who confirmed that Mrs. Foster had appeared confused and distressed while shopping and had not displayed the typical behavior patterns associated with intentional shoplifting. The items involved were worth less than $20, and Mrs. Foster had immediately offered to pay for them when confronted by security personnel rather than pursuing criminal charges. Detective Johnson had worked with store management to develop an alternative resolution that addressed the immediate situation while also providing Mrs. Foster with support for the underlying problems that had contributed to the incident. The store had agreed to allow Mrs. Foster to pay for the items and had provided her with information about layaway programs that would allow her to purchase gifts for her children over time, rather than all at once. Detective Johnson had also connected Mrs. Foster with social services resources that could provide temporary assistance with her family's financial needs while her husband searched for new employment. The report documented his follow-up call to confirm that Mrs. Foster had successfully accessed these resources and that her family situation had stabilized. Report number 874527 described a vandalism incident at Roosevelt High School, where someone had spray-painted graffiti on the exterior wall of the gymnasium during the weekend. Principal Matthews had discovered the vandalism on Monday morning and had immediately contacted police to report the incident and request assistance with the investigation. Officer Rodriguez had responded to the call, conducting a detailed examination of the vandalism and documenting it with photographs and written descriptions. The graffiti consisted of several large letters and symbols that appeared to be gang-related, though Officer Rodriguez noted in his report that the quality and style of the work suggested it might have been created by someone attempting to imitate gang graffiti rather than by actual gang members. The investigation had required Officer Rodriguez to interview several students and staff members who might have observed suspicious activity around the school during the weekend. This process had revealed that 2 students had been seen in the area on Saturday evening, though they had not been observed actually creating the graffiti. The report documented Officer Rodriguez's patient work to identify the individuals responsible for the vandalism without creating unnecessary suspicion or disruption within the school community. He had worked closely with school administrators to gather information while being careful to protect the privacy and rights of students who were not involved in the incident. The breakthrough in the case had come when Officer Rodriguez discovered that the graffiti included specific symbols and references that were unique to a video game that was popular among local teenagers. This insight had led him to focus his investigation on students who were known to be particularly interested in the game, eventually identifying 2 17-year-old students who had created the graffiti as part of what they considered a harmless prank. The report included detailed documentation of Officer Rodriguez's interviews with the students and their parents, noting that both young men had been genuinely surprised to learn that their actions were considered vandalism and could have serious legal consequences. They had thought they were creating harmless artwork that would be easily removed and had not considered the impact their actions might have on the school community. Rather than pursuing formal charges, Officer Rodriguez had worked with school administrators and the students' parents to develop a resolution that included both accountability and education. The students had been required to clean the graffiti from the gymnasium wall and to participate in a community service project that involved helping with maintenance and beautification work around the school. The report documented the successful completion of this alternative resolution, noting that both students had gained a better understanding of the impact of vandalism on their community and had become more thoughtful about the consequences of their actions. Principal Matthews had reported that both students had continued to demonstrate improved judgment and had become positive contributors to the school environment. Detective Walsh paused in his typing to stretch his fingers and reflect on the patterns he saw in these reports. Each incident was unique in its specific details, but they all shared common elements that spoke to the fundamental challenges of living in a complex community where individual actions could have unintended consequences for others. The reports also demonstrated the importance of patience and understanding in police work. The way that taking time to understand the full context of an incident often led to more effective and more satisfying resolutions than simply applying the law in its most literal sense. Officers like Rodriguez, Johnson, and Chun had understood that their job was not just to enforce rules, but to help people learn how to live together more successfully. Report number 874528 dealt with a missing bicycle case that had required extensive investigation and demonstrated the department's commitment to addressing even minor crimes with thoroughness and care. 10-year-old Michael Chen had reported that his bicycle had been stolen from the rack outside the public library while he was attending a Saturday morning reading program. Officer Kim had responded to the report, conducting a detailed investigation that treated Michael's concern with the same seriousness that would be applied to any other theft case. The report documented Officer Kim's examination of the bike rack, her interviews with library staff and other children who had been at the library that morning, and her review of the library's limited security footage. The investigation had revealed that Michael's bicycle had not actually been stolen, but had been moved by library maintenance staff who were cleaning the area around the bike rack. The bicycle had been placed in the library's lost and found area, where it had remained while Michael searched the parking lot and surrounding streets for his missing property. Officer Kim's report included detailed documentation of the miscommunication that had led to Michael's distress, noting that the library's procedures for handling items that needed to be temporarily moved were not clearly communicated to patrons. She had worked with library administrators to develop better signage and communication protocols to prevent similar incidents in the future. More importantly, the report documented Officer Kim's efforts to use the incident as a teaching opportunity for Michael and other children who had witnessed the investigation. She had explained the importance of reporting theft promptly and accurately, had demonstrated the steps that police take to investigate missing property, and had emphasized the value of checking all possibilities before assuming that a crime had occurred. The case had concluded with Michael's joyful reunion with his bicycle, and with improved procedures at the library that would prevent similar confusion in the future. Officer Kim's report noted that several parents had expressed appreciation for the thorough investigation and for the educational value of watching a professional police officer at work. Report number 874529 described the SIA noise complaint that had evolved into a more complex investigation involving multiple households and requiring careful mediation between neighbors with different lifestyle preferences and expectations. The initial complaint had been filed by Mr. and Mrs. Patterson, who lived next door to a young couple who regularly played music late into the evening. Officer Martinez had responded to the complaint, conducting separate interviews with both households to understand the nature of the conflict and the perspectives of all parties involved. The report documented his discovery that the situation involved more than simple inconsideration, encompassing generational differences, work schedule conflicts, and communication breakdowns that had allowed minor annoyances to escalate into serious neighborhood tensions. The young couple, Mark and Sarah Williams, both worked in restaurants and kept schedules that were dramatically different from those of their retired neighbors. They typically came home from work after midnight and unwound by listening to music, which they kept at what they considered reasonable volumes, but which the Pattersons found disruptive to their sleep. Officer Martinez's report included detailed documentation of his efforts to help both households understand each other's situations and develop compromises that would allow them to coexist peacefully. The Pattersons had agreed to be more tolerant of music before midnight on weekends, while the Williams couple had committed to ending their music by 11 p.m. on weeknights and using headphones after midnight, regardless of the day of the week. The report also documented Officer Martinez's work to establish better communication channels between the neighbors, encouraging them to speak directly with each other about problems, rather than allowing frustrations to build until police intervention became necessary. He had provided both households with his direct contact information and had encouraged them to call him if they needed assistance with future negotiations. Follow-up reports included documentation of Officer Martinez's periodic check-ins with both households over the following months, noting that the compromise had been successful and that the neighbors had actually developed a friendly relationship based on their improved understanding of each other's circumstances. Report number 874530 dealt with a case of credit card fraud that required extensive investigation and coordination with financial institutions and retail establishments throughout the city. Mrs. Janet Morrison had reported that someone had been using her credit card to make unauthorized purchases at various stores, despite the fact that she still had the physical card in her possession. Detective Walsh had taken the lead on the investigation, working with Mrs. Morrison's credit card company to track the unauthorized transactions and identify patterns that might lead to the perpetrator. The report documented his methodical analysis of purchase locations, times, and amounts, looking for connections that might reveal how the fraud was being committed. The investigation had revealed that Mrs. Morrison's credit card information had been copied during a legitimate transaction at a local restaurant, where an employee had been using a small device to record customer credit card data for later fraudulent use. Detective Walsh's report included detailed documentation of his work with restaurant management to identify the employee responsible and to implement better security measures to prevent similar incidents. The case had required extensive coordination with multiple agencies and businesses, as the fraudulent purchases had been made at stores throughout the region, and the credit card company was based in another state. Detective Walsh's report documented his patient worked to build a comprehensive case that would hold up in court, while also ensuring that Mrs. Morrison was not held financially responsible for the unauthorized charges. The investigation had concluded with the arrest of the restaurant employee and the recovery of equipment that had been used to copy credit card information from dozens of customers. Detective Walsh's report included documentation of his work with other victims who had been affected by the same fraud scheme, helping them understand the steps necessary to protect themselves from future incidents. As Detective Walsh continued typing these reports, he reflected on the way that each case represented a small but important moment in the ongoing effort to maintain order and trust within the community. The credit card fraud case had required technical expertise and patient investigation, while the noise complaint had demanded mediation skills and cultural sensitivity. What united all of these cases was the understanding that effective police work required more than just technical law enforcement skills. It demanded patience, empathy, creativity, and a genuine commitment to understanding the complex web of relationships and circumstances that shaped human behavior within a community. The reports themselves served multiple purposes beyond simple documentation. They preserved institutional knowledge that could benefit future officers dealing with similar cases. They provided accountability and transparency for police actions. And they created a historical record of how the department had evolved in its approach to serving the community. Detective Walsh finished typing report number 874530 and inserted a fresh piece of paper into his typewriter, ready to begin documenting the next case that would add another layer to the department's accumulated understanding of the community it served. Each report was both an ending and a beginning, closing one chapter of investigation while providing insights that would inform future work. The steady rhythm of typing continued through the night, creating the written foundation upon which effective police work was built. These reports would be filed, referenced, and studied, becoming part of the vast archive of human experience that allowed law enforcement to learn from the past, while adapting to meet the changing needs of an evolving community. The archive room in the basement of the Central Police Station stretched beyond what most visitors could imagine. A labyrinth of metal shelving that disappeared into shadows, so deep that even the overhead fluorescent lights could not penetrate them completely. Records clerk Margaret Sullivan had worked in these archives for 32 years, and she knew every aisle, every cabinet, every forgotten corner where files had been placed and then slowly covered by the gentle accumulation of dust and time. The air in the archives carried a particular scent, a mixture of old paper, metal filing cabinets, and something indefinable that Margaret had come to think of as the smell of preserved time itself. It was not unpleasant, this archival atmosphere, but rather comforting in its consistency, a reliable presence that had remained unchanged through decades of administrative reorganizations, technological upgrades, and personnel changes. Walking through the archives at dawn, when the building above was still largely empty and the only sounds were the gentle hum of ventilation systems and the occasional settling of old building materials, Margaret felt a profound sense of connection to the accumulated history that surrounded her. These files represented more than bureaucratic record-keeping. They were the physical manifestation of the department's institutional memory, the collected wisdom of thousands of officers who had encountered every conceivable variety of human behavior and had taken the time to document their observations for future reference. Aisle 17A contained files from the late 1970s, boxes and boxes of cases that had been closed for nearly a decade but were still maintained, according to department retention policies. The boxes themselves showed the gentle effects of time, their cardboard corners slightly softened, their labels faded to the point where Margaret needed her reading glasses to decipher the case. Numbers and dates that had been written in careful ballpoint, penned by clerks who had retired years ago. She pulled box 78 to 447 from its shelf. Feeling the familiar weight of paper and bureaucracy that had once represented urgent human dramas but now rested in peaceful dormancy. The box contained files from July through September of 1978, a summer that had been particularly busy for the department due to a series of break-ins in the residential neighborhoods north of downtown. Opening the box released a faint cloud of dust that danced in the morning light filtering through the small windows near the ceiling of the archive room. Margaret had long ago stopped trying to prevent the accumulation of dust. It was simply part of the natural aging process that affected all archived materials. A gentle coating that spoke to the passage of time and the quiet rest that these files had earned after their active service. The first file in the box dealt with a burglary on Elm Street, reported by Mrs. Dorothy Kowalski on a humid Tuesday morning in July. The investigating officer had been Detective Raymond Chun, whose careful handwriting filled page after page of the standard report forms. Margaret could picture Detective Chun at his desk, methodically documenting every detail of the Teal case with the patience that had characterized police work in that era. Mrs. Kowalski had returned from a weekend visit to her sister's house to find that someone had entered her home through a basement window and had taken several items of modest value: a small radio, a jewelry box containing costume jewelry, and a set of silver-plated serving spoons that had belonged to her mother. The monetary value of the stolen items was less than $50, but the emotional impact on Mrs. Kowalski had been significant, particularly regarding the loss of her mother's spoons. Detective Chun's report included detailed diagrams of the house, showing the point of entry and the path the burglar had taken through the rooms. His notes indicated that the intruder had been careful not to disturb items that weren't taken, suggesting someone who was looking for specific types of objects rather than simply grabbing whatever was available. The basement window had been pried open with what appeared to be a screwdriver or similar tool, but the damage had been minimal and precise. Margaret found these old reports fascinating not just for their content, but for what they revealed about the evolution of police investigative techniques. Detective Chun had included details that modern officers might consider routine, but which in 1978 represented careful attention to forensic evidence that was still developing as a field. He had taken photographs of the basement window, had made plaster casts of footprints found in the soft soil outside, and had carefully cataloged fingerprints found on surfaces throughout the house. The case had been solved 3 weeks later when Detective Chun connected the Elm Street burglary to a series of similar break-ins throughout the neighborhood. The perpetrator had been a 17-year-old named Michael Harrison, who had been taking items to sell in order to buy drugs, though the amounts involved were so small that it seemed more like a cry for help than a serious criminal enterprise. Margaret turned to the follow-up reports that detailed Detective Chun's work with the Harrison family to address the underlying problems that had led to the burglaries. The young man had been struggling with depression and drug use, problems that his parents had not recognized or had not known how to address. Detective Chun had connected the family with social services and counseling resources, and the case had been resolved through a combination of community service and treatment rather than incarceration. The file included a letter from Mrs. Kowalski, written 6 months after the burglary, thanking Detective Chun for the recovery of her mother's spoons and for his gentle handling of a situation that could have been much more traumatic. She had mentioned in the letter that she had visited Michael Harrison during his community service at the local food bank and had been impressed by his genuine remorse and his commitment to making amends for his actions. This kind of follow-up documentation was typical of the files from that era. Margaret had noticed over her years of managing the archives, officers had taken the time to track the long-term outcomes of their cases. understanding that the real measure of successful police work was not just the resolution of immediate problems, but the prevention of future incidents through attention to underlying causes. She replaced the Kowalski file and pulled the next one from the box. This one dealing with a missing person case that had required extensive investigation over several months. The subject was Eleanor Morrison, a 47-year-old librarian who had disappeared from her apartment on a Sunday evening in August, leaving behind no note or indication of where she might have gone. The initial report, filed by Mrs. Morrison's supervisor when she failed to appear for work on Monday morning, had triggered a comprehensive investigation led by Detective Sarah Walsh. Margaret could see from the thickness of the file that the case had generated extensive documentation, with reports from multiple officers and agencies spanning several months of active investigation. Detective Walsh had approached the case with the systematic thoroughness that characterized missing person investigations of that era. Her first report included detailed descriptions of Mrs. Morrison's apartment, noting that nothing appeared to be missing or disturbed, that her car was still in the parking lot, and that she had left behind her purse, keys, and all identification. The apartment had been neat and organized, with no signs of struggle or forced entry. The investigation had expanded to include interviews with Mrs. Morrison's co-workers, friends, and family members. Each conversation documented in separate reports that painted a picture of a woman who had been struggling with depression since her divorce 2 years earlier. Several people had mentioned that Mrs. Morrison had seemed particularly distressed in the weeks before her disappearance, though none had interpreted her behavior as indicating suicidal intentions. Detective Walsh had worked with local hospitals, morgues, and police departments throughout the region, sending Mrs. Morrison's description and photograph to agencies that might have encountered her if she had traveled to other areas. The file contained responses from dozens of agencies, most reporting no contact with anyone matching Mrs. Morrison's description, but all demonstrating the cooperative network that law enforcement had developed for handling missing person cases. The breakthrough in the case had come after 2 months of investigation when Detective Walsh received a call from a hospital in Denver, Colorado. Mrs. Morrison had been admitted as a Jane Doe after being found unconscious in a downtown park, apparently suffering from a combination of exposure and malnutrition. She had been carrying no identification and had been unable to provide coherent information about her identity when she regained consciousness. Asterisk. Detective Walsh had traveled to Denver personally to confirm Mrs. Morrison's identity and to begin the process of understanding what had happened during the 2 months of her disappearance. The file included detailed reports of these conversations, revealing that Mrs. Morrison had been experiencing what doctors described as a dissociative episode related to her depression, during which she had lost contact with her normal identity and had been living as a homeless person in various cities throughout the western states. The case had concluded with Mrs. Morrison's return home and her entry into a comprehensive treatment program that addressed both her mental health needs and the social isolation that had contributed to her crisis. Detective Walsh's final report included documentation of her follow-up contacts with Mrs. Morrison over the following year, noting that the treatment had been successful and that Mrs. Morrison had returned to work and begun rebuilding her social connections. Margaret found this kind of case particularly moving because it demonstrated the human complexity that police officers encountered in their daily work. Mrs. Morrison's disappearance could not be solved through traditional investigative techniques alone. It had required patience, empathy, and a willingness to understand that some human problems exceeded the normal boundaries of law enforcement, but still required police attention and resources. The archives contain thousands of such cases, each one representing a moment when an individual or family had encountered circumstances that exceeded their ability to cope using normal social resources. Margaret had come to think of the police department as a kind of social safety net, catching people when they fell through the cracks of other institutional support systems. She moved to another section of the archives, this one containing files from the early 1980s that dealt with what the department had classified as quality-of-life crimes. These were offenses that might not have been serious in legal terms, but that had significant impacts on community cohesion and resident sense of safety and well-being. Box 82 to 156 contained files dealing with a series of incidents involving public intoxication and disorderly conduct in the downtown area during the summer of 1982. The cases had been handled by Officer Daniel Rodriguez, whose reports demonstrated a creative approach to addressing the underlying causes of these recurring problems, rather than simply processing the same individuals through the legal system repeatedly. The incidents had centered around 3 individuals who had been arrested multiple times for public intoxication, creating a cycle of arrest, brief incarceration, release, and rearrest that was not solving the underlying problem of alcoholism and homelessness. Officer Rodriguez had recognized that traditional law enforcement approaches were ineffective for addressing these cases and had begun working with social service agencies to develop alternative interventions. His reports documented the development of what he called a coordinated support approach, involving representatives from the police department, the county health department, local homeless shelters, and Alcoholics Anonymous. Rather than simply arresting the 3 individuals when they were found intoxicated in public, this team had worked to provide immediate assistance with sobering up, followed by longer-term support for addressing their alcohol dependency and housing needs. The approach had required significant documentation to track the various interventions and their effectiveness. Officer Rodriguez had maintained detailed records of each contact with the 3 individuals, noting their physical and mental condition, the services provided, and their response to different types of assistance. The files contained charts and graphs showing the dramatic reduction in arrests that had resulted from this coordinated approach. Margaret was particularly impressed by the thoroughness of Officer Rodriguez's documentation because it provided a clear record of how innovative police practices could be developed and refined over time. His reports included not just descriptions of what had been done, but analysis of what had worked and what had not, creating a resource that could guide similar efforts in the future. The success of the program had led to its expansion to address other quality of life issues in the downtown area. Officer Rodriguez had worked with business owners to address concerns about loitering and panhandling, developing approaches that balance the needs of businesses with respect for the rights and dignity of homeless individuals. His reports documented the gradual improvement in relationships between different community groups as understanding and cooperation replaced suspicion and conflict. Moving deeper into the archives, Margaret found herself in sections that she visited less frequently, areas where files from the 1960s and early 1970s rested in metal cabinets that showed their age, through small dents and scratches accumulated over decades of use. These older files were maintained primarily for historical reference, as most of the cases they contained had been closed for so long that they were unlikely to be reopened. Cabinet 67C contained files from a period when the police department had been dealing with significant social changes related to civil rights activism and anti-war protests. The files documented the department's efforts to balance law enforcement responsibilities with respect for constitutional rights of assembly and free speech, a challenge that had required careful attention to both legal requirements and community relations. One file dealt with a protest march that had been organized in the downtown area in March of 1968, an event that had required extensive planning and coordination between police, city officials, and protest organizers. The file contained correspondence between Police Chief William Thompson and march organizers, working out details about parade routes, crowd control, and safety measures that would allow the protest to proceed peacefully while minimizing disruption to normal city activities. The reports from the day of the march documented the careful preparation that had gone into ensuring a peaceful event. Officer assignments had been made based on their experience with crowd control and their ability to interact positively with protesters. The department had established communication protocols that allowed real-time coordination between different units and had prepared contingency plans for various scenarios that might have required intervention. Margaret found the reports from that era particularly interesting because they documented a period when police departments throughout the country were learning how to handle new types of social challenges. The civil rights movement and anti-war protests had created situations that were not covered by traditional police training, requiring officers to develop new skills and approaches based on their experience and judgment. The march had proceeded without major incident, thanks to the careful preparation and the mutual respect that had been established between police and protesters during the planning process. The final reports noted that several protest organizers had written to thank the department for their professional handling of the event and their recognition of the protesters' constitutional rights. These older files also contained evidence of how police work had evolved in response to changing social conditions and expectations. Margaret could see clear differences in language, approach, and documentation between files from the 1960s and those from later decades, reflecting the department's adaptation to new legal requirements, community expectations, and professional standards. In Cabinet 71B, she found files dealing with domestic violence cases from the early 1970s, a time when police responses to such incidents were beginning to change as society developed better understanding of the dynamics involved in abusive relationships. The files documented the gradual shift from treating domestic violence as a private family matter to recognizing it as a serious crime that required professional law enforcement intervention. One case file told the story of repeated calls to the Henderson household, where Mrs. Patricia Henderson had been subjected to increasingly severe physical abuse by her husband Robert. The early reports, written in 1971, reflected the limited options that had been available to officers responding to domestic violence calls at that time. Without clear evidence of immediate danger or Mrs. Henderson's willingness to press charges, officers had been limited to mediating the immediate conflict and encouraging the couple to seek counseling. The file documented the gradual escalation of violence in the Henderson household and the growing frustration of officers who recognized the seriousness of the situation but lacked the legal tools and social resources necessary to provide effective intervention. Officer Margaret Kim had responded to multiple calls at the Henderson residence, and her reports showed her increasing concern about Mrs. Henderson's safety and her efforts to connect the family with available support services. The case had reached a crisis point in November of 1972 when Mrs. Henderson had been hospitalized with injuries that clearly indicated severe physical assault. This incident had finally provided the evidence necessary for criminal charges, and Robert Henderson had been arrested and prosecuted for assault. The file included documentation of Officer Kim's work with Mrs. Henderson to access support services and legal assistance that helped her establish independence from her abusive husband. Margaret found these older domestic violence files particularly poignant because they documented both the limitations that officers had faced in addressing these cases and their persistent efforts to find ways to help victims despite those limitations. The files showed how individual officers like Margaret Kim had gone beyond their minimal legal requirements to provide support and advocacy for victims who had few other sources of assistance. The evolution of domestic violence responses was clearly visible in the archives, with later files showing the development of specialized training, victim advocacy programs, and legal reforms that had given officers more effective tools for addressing these cases. Margaret could see how the accumulated experience documented in these older files had contributed to the development of more effective approaches that were now standard practice. She moved to an area of the archives that contained files from special investigations that had required extensive documentation over extended periods. Box 75289 contained materials related to a fraud investigation that had begun in 1975 and had continued for more than 2 years as investigators worked to unravel a complex scheme involving multiple businesses and financial institutions. The case had begun with a routine audit at Morrison Securities, a local investment firm, which had revealed irregularities in client accounts that suggested systematic embezzlement. Detective Lieutenant Robert Walsh had been assigned to lead the investigation, which had eventually expanded to include multiple jurisdictions and federal agencies as the scope of the fraud became apparent. The file contained hundreds of pages of financial records, witness statements, and investigative reports that documented Detective Walsh's methodical approach to unraveling the complex web of transactions that had hidden the embezzlement. The scheme had involved creating false investment accounts, forging documents, and manipulating computer records to hide the theft of more than $200,000 from client accounts. Margaret was impressed by the thoroughness of Detective Walsh's documentation, which had been essential for building a case that could survive the challenges of defense attorneys who had attempted to characterize the evidence as circumstantial or unreliable. The investigation had required coordination with banking officials, computer specialists, and forensic accountants, all of whom had contributed expertise that the police department itself did not possess. The case had concluded with the conviction of 3 individuals who had been involved in the fraud scheme, including the president of Morrison Securities and 2 employees who had helped execute the complex transactions. Detective Walsh's final report included documentation of the recovery of most of the stolen funds and the implementation of new oversight procedures at financial institutions throughout the region. The fraud investigation demonstrated the evolution of police work in response to increasingly sophisticated criminal schemes that required specialized knowledge and investigative techniques. The files showed how the department had adapted to handle cases involving computer technology and complex financial transactions, areas that had not been part of traditional police training but had become necessary skills for modern investigators. Moving to another section of the archives, Margaret found files dealing with cases that had required coordination between the police department and other agencies or organizations. Box 79 to 445 contained materials related to a missing child case that had mobilized resources from multiple law enforcement agencies, volunteer organizations, and community groups. 7-year-old Amanda Foster had disappeared from her neighborhood on a Saturday afternoon in June of 1979, triggering an immediate and comprehensive search effort. The case had been handled by Detective Sarah Johnson, whose reports documented the systematic approach that had been used to coordinate the efforts of dozens of searchers while maintaining the careful documentation necessary for potential criminal prosecution. The initial search had focused on the immediate neighborhood where Amanda had last been seen, with officers conducting door-to-door interviews and organizing volunteer search teams to cover nearby parks, vacant lots, and wooded areas. Detective Johnson's reports showed the careful balance that had been maintained between the urgency of finding Amanda quickly and the need to preserve potential evidence that might be crucial if the case involved criminal activity. The search had expanded over several days to include areas throughout the county, with volunteer organizations providing personnel and resources that supplemented official law enforcement efforts. Detective Johnson had documented the contributions of various groups, including search and rescue teams, citizen volunteers, and local businesses that had provided food and supplies for the searchers. Amanda had been found after 3 days, safe but frightened, in an abandoned house several miles from her neighborhood. She had been held there by a neighbor who had been experiencing mental health problems and had taken Amanda in what he believed was an effort to protect her from dangers that existed only in his disturbed imagination. The resolution of the case had required careful handling to ensure Amanda's safety while also addressing the mental health needs of her captor. Detective Johnson's reports included detailed documentation of Amanda's condition when she was found, the circumstances of her captivity, and the steps taken to ensure her physical and emotional recovery. The case had concluded with the neighbor receiving treatment for his mental health problems rather than prosecution, a resolution that had been supported by Amanda's family and had reflected the department's understanding of the complex factors that had led to the incident. The Amanda Foster case had led to the development of improved protocols for handling missing child cases, including better coordination procedures with volunteer organizations and more systematic approaches to managing large-scale search efforts. Detective Johnson's comprehensive documentation of the case had provided the foundation for training materials that had been used to prepare officers for similar situations. As Margaret continued her tour through the archives, she reflected on the patterns she saw in these accumulated files. Each case represented a moment when normal social mechanisms had broken down and police intervention had been necessary to restore order or provide assistance. The files documented not just the immediate resolution of specific problems, but the gradual development of institutional knowledge about how to handle the complex variety of human situations that law enforcement encountered. The archives served as a kind of collective memory for the police department, preserving lessons learned from decades of experience and making that knowledge available to future officers who would face similar challenges. Margaret had often been asked to research old cases when current investigations encountered unusual circumstances, and she had found that the archives almost always contained relevant precedents that could guide contemporary police work. She paused at Cabinet 83A, which contained files from a period when the department had been dealing with a series of arson cases that had required extensive investigation and cooperation with fire department officials and insurance investigators. The cases had been handled by Detective Michael Chun, whose reports demonstrated the specialized knowledge necessary for investigating fires that might have been deliberately set. The arson investigation had required Detective Chun to learn about fire behavior, accelerant detection, and building construction in order to distinguish between accidental fires and those that had been intentionally set. His reports included detailed descriptions of fire scenes, analysis of burn patterns, and documentation of physical evidence that might indicate the use of accelerants or other methods of deliberate ignition. The case had been complicated by the fact that several of the fires had occurred in buildings that were already deteriorating and might have been prone to accidental fires caused by electrical problems or other structural issues. Detective Chun had worked with fire department arson investigators and insurance company specialists to develop the expertise necessary to make these crucial distinctions. The investigation had eventually identified a pattern of fires that had been set by a property owner who was attempting to collect insurance money on buildings that were becoming financially burdensome. The case had required extensive documentation of the property owner's financial situation, insurance policies, and movements on the dates when fires had occurred. Detective Chun's reports showed the painstaking work that had been necessary to build a case that could withstand the challenges of defense attorneys who had argued that the fires could have been accidental. The investigation had required coordination with multiple agencies and specialists, all of whom had contributed pieces of evidence that had eventually created a comprehensive picture of deliberate arson. The case had concluded with the property owner's conviction and imprisonment, as well as changes in insurance industry practices that made it more difficult for individuals to profit from deliberately destroying their own property. Detective Chun's thorough documentation had provided a model for future arson investigations and had contributed to the development of specialized training for officers who might encounter similar cases. These specialized investigations represented another dimension of police work that was documented in the archives. Cases that required officers to develop expertise in areas that were not part of traditional law enforcement training. The files showed how the department had adapted to handle increasingly complex criminal schemes that required technical knowledge and specialized investigative techniques. Margaret's journey through the archives had taken her through decades of accumulated experience, from routine patrol calls to complex investigations that had required months or years to resolve. Each file represented a small piece of the larger story of how a police department had evolved to meet the changing needs of its community while maintaining its fundamental commitment to public safety and service. Dust that settled on these files was not simply the result of neglect or abandonment. It was the natural patina that accumulated on well-earned rest. These cases had been active once, urgent and demanding, requiring the full attention and skill of dedicated officers. Now they rested peacefully in the archives, their immediate purpose fulfilled, but their value as institutional memory preserved for future reference. As the morning progressed and the building above began to fill with the sounds of daily police work, Margaret made her way back through the aisles of filing cabinets toward her desk at the front of the archive room. She carried with her a renewed appreciation for the accumulated wisdom that surrounded her. The countless hours of patient police work that had been documented and preserved in these quiet corridors of institutional memory. The archives would continue to grow, day by day, as new cases were closed and new files were added to the collection. Each edition would represent another small victory in the ongoing effort to maintain order and safety in a complex world. Another piece of experience that might guide future officers in their work. The dust would continue to settle, gently marking the passage of time while preserving the stories contained in these files for anyone who needed to understand how dedicated public servants had addressed the challenges of their era. In the quiet peace of the archives, the accumulated wisdom of decades of police work rested safely, waiting to inform and inspire the next generation of officers who would face their own unique challenges with the same commitment to service that had characterized their predecessors. Asterisk. The Riverside County Courthouse cast long shadows across the plaza, even during midday. Its neoclassical columns and granite steps, speaking to an era when public buildings were constructed to convey permanence and dignity rather than mere functionality. Security guard Thomas Mitchell had walked these halls for 18 years, and he had come to know every corner of the building in all its moods. The busy energy of court days, the administrative quiet of weekends, and the profound stillness that settled over everything during the deep hours of night. At 3 a.m. The courthouse existed in a state of suspended animation, its vast spaces holding memories of thousands of trials, hearings, and legal proceedings that had unfolded within its walls over the past century. The marble floors, polished smooth by decades of foot traffic, reflected the dim security lighting in ways that created shifting patterns of light and shadow. As Thomas made his rounds through the building, Courtroom 3A, where Judge Margaret Chun had presided for nearly 2 decades, retained a particular atmosphere even when empty. The mahogany benches, arranged in precise rows, seemed to hold the weight of all the human dramas that had played out before them. The witness stand, positioned at an angle that allowed clear sight lines to both judge and jury, had been occupied by thousands of individuals over the years, each one carrying their own piece of truth or deception, hope or despair. Thomas often paused in his rounds to stand quietly in the empty courtrooms, feeling the accumulated history that permeated these spaces. The judicial process, with its careful rituals and formal procedures, had transformed raw human conflict into something that could be weighed, measured, and resolved according to principles that transcended the immediate emotions of those involved. The walls of Courtroom 3A were lined with portraits of judges who had served the court over the decades. Their formal poses and judicial robes, creating a visual representation of the continuity that characterized the legal system. Judge Robert Morrison, who had served from 1952 to 1978, gazed down from his portrait with the stern but compassionate expression that colleagues remembered as perfectly capturing his approach to the law. During Judge Morrison's tenure, the courthouse had seen a transformation in the types of cases that came before it, reflecting broader social changes that had affected the entire community. The civil rights era had brought new categories of legal challenges, while changing social attitudes had influenced how courts approached issues like domestic violence, juvenile crime, and drug-related offenses. Thomas had heard stories from veteran court employees about some of the landmark cases that had been decided in these rooms. Cases that had set precedents still referenced by attorneys and judges throughout the region. The courthouse archives, located in the basement beneath the main courtrooms, contained transcripts and documents from thousands of these proceedings, creating a comprehensive record of how the community had addressed its most serious conflicts over the decades. Moving through the corridor that connected the main courtrooms, Thomas passed the jury assembly room, where citizens had gathered to fulfill their civic duty in the democratic process of justice. The room contained rows of chairs arranged to face a small podium, where court officials explained the jury selection process and the responsibilities that came with serving on a jury. The jury assembly room held its own quiet dignity, representing the principle that justice required the participation of ordinary citizens who brought their life experience and common sense to the resolution of legal disputes. Thomas had observed many jury selection processes over his years at the courthouse, watching as groups of strangers were transformed into deliberative bodies capable of making decisions that would profoundly affect the lives of their fellow citizens. Adjacent to the jury assembly room was the jury deliberation suite, a series of smaller rooms where juries retired to discuss the evidence and reach their verdicts. These rooms were furnished simply, with a table large enough to accommodate 12 jurors and their materials, chairs that encouraged both comfort and focus, and walls bare except for instructions about the deliberation process. The deliberation rooms maintained a particular atmosphere of concentrated thought and careful consideration. Thomas had sometimes heard the muted sounds of discussion emanating from these rooms during active trials, the voices rising and falling as jurors worked through complex questions of fact and law. The decisions reached in these rooms had determined the guilt or innocence of defendants, the liability of parties in civil disputes, and the compensation owed to those who had been wronged. The courthouse also contained spaces dedicated to the administrative functions that supported the judicial process. The clerk's office, located on the first floor, maintained the official records of all court proceedings, ensuring that every filing, every motion, every order was properly documented and preserved. The filing cabinets in the clerk's office contained the paper trail of justice, creating a comprehensive archive of how legal disputes had been initiated, conducted, and resolved. Chief Clerk Dorothy Walsh had overseen this office for 25 years, managing the complex systems that kept court proceedings running smoothly and ensuring that all participants in the legal process had access to the documents and information they needed. Her office had adapted to numerous changes in legal procedures and record-keeping requirements, always maintaining the accuracy and completeness that the judicial system required. The courthouse basement housed additional administrative functions, including the probation department offices, where presentence investigations were conducted and supervision plans were developed for defendants who had been sentenced to community-based penalties. Probation officer Michael Rodriguez had worked in these basement offices for 15 years, conducting interviews and assessments that helped judges make informed sentencing decisions. The probation offices were designed to facilitate confidential conversations between officers and their clients, with soundproofing that ensured privacy. and furnishings that struck a balance between official authority and therapeutic support. These rooms had witnessed thousands of conversations about addiction, family problems, employment challenges, and personal struggles that had contributed to criminal behavior. Officer Rodriguez had come to understand that effective probation supervision required more than just monitoring compliance with court orders. It demanded a comprehensive understanding of the social and economic factors that influenced criminal behavior and behavior, commitment to helping individuals develop the skills and resources necessary for successful reintegration into the community. The courthouse holding cells, located in the basement near the probation offices, provided temporary detention for defendants who were in custody during court proceedings. These cells were spartanly furnished but maintained according to strict standards for safety and hygiene, reflecting the principle that even those accused of crimes retained fundamental human rights that must be respected throughout the legal process. Deputy Sheriff Patricia Morrison, who supervised courthouse security, had ensured that the holding cells were operated with professionalism and dignity, understanding that the conditions of pretrial detention could significantly affect a defendant's ability to participate effectively in their own defense. The cells were regularly inspected and maintained, with protocols that protected both the safety of those in custody and the security of court proceedings. The courthouse cafeteria, which served judges, attorneys, court staff, and members of the public during business hours, became a different kind of space during Thomas's nighttime rounds. The dining room, with its institutional furniture and fluorescent lighting, held traces of the countless informal conversations that had taken place there. Attorneys discussing strategy, court employees sharing observations about cases, and family members of defendants or victims finding moments of respite during long days of testimony and deliberation. During the day, the cafeteria had served as a kind of neutral ground where the various participants in the legal process could interact outside the formal constraints of courtroom procedure. Thomas had observed plea negotiations conducted over coffee, family conferences held at corner tables, and attorney-client consultations that required privacy but not the formality of official meeting rooms. The courthouse law library, located on the second floor, contained the legal resources that attorneys and judges consulted when researching complex questions of law. The library's shelves held volumes of statutes, case law, and legal commentary that represented centuries of accumulated legal wisdom, providing the foundation for arguments and decisions that would affect real people's lives. Law librarian Janet Foster had maintained this collection for 12 years, ensuring that legal professionals had access to current and historical legal authorities, while also assisting members of the public who were representing themselves in legal proceedings. The library served as a bridge between the theoretical principles of law and their practical application in specific cases. The judges' chambers, private offices where judges conducted research, wrote opinions, and held confidential conferences with attorneys, were distributed throughout the courthouse according to the seniority and preferences of individual judges. These offices reflected the personality and working style of their occupants while maintaining the dignity appropriate to the judicial function. Judge Chun's chambers, for example, were furnished with traditional legal furniture, but also contained personal touches that reflected her interests in gardening and classical music. The walls displayed her law school diploma alongside photographs of her family and artwork created by local students. The office served as both a working space and a retreat where she could reflect on the complex decisions that her position required. The chambers also contained small conference areas where judges could meet privately with attorneys to discuss procedural matters, settlement possibilities, or legal questions that arose during trials. These informal conferences often resolved issues that might otherwise require formal hearings, contributing to the efficient administration of justice while ensuring that all parties had opportunities to present their positions. Adjacent to the main courthouse building stood the county jail, a more modern facility that housed defendants who were awaiting trial and those who had been sentenced to terms of local incarceration. The jail represented a different aspect of the criminal justice system, focused on security and rehabilitation rather than the deliberative processes that characterized court proceedings. Correctional Officer David Chun had worked at the county jail for 10 years, supervising inmates and managing the daily operations that kept the facility running safely and efficiently. The jail housed a diverse population of individuals who were at various stages of the criminal justice process, each with their own story of how they had come to be incarcerated. The jail's housing units were designed to separate different categories of inmates according to their security classification, the nature of their charges, and their individual needs for protection or special supervision. The design reflected both security requirements and recognition that incarceration should be conducted in ways that preserved human dignity and supported eventual reintegration into the Fanlo community. Officer Chun had observed the profound impact that incarceration had on individuals and their families, understanding that even brief periods of detention could disrupt employment, housing, and family relationships in ways that created long-term challenges for successful reintegration. The jail's programs focused on addressing these challenges through education, counseling, and job training that prepared inmates for their eventual release. The jail's visiting areas facilitated contact between inmates and their families, providing supervised opportunities for communication and support that helped maintain crucial relationships during periods of incarceration. These visits were often emotional experiences for all involved, representing both the consequences of criminal behavior and the hope for eventual redemption and reconciliation. The jail's medical unit provided health care services for inmates who required treatment for physical or mental health conditions, often serving individuals who had limited access to health care in the community. The medical staff understood that addressing health problems during incarceration could contribute to successful reintegration while also meeting basic humanitarian obligations to those in custody. The courthouse and jail complex represented different but complementary aspects of the criminal justice system. One focused on determining guilt or innocence through careful deliberation. The other focused on carrying out the consequences of criminal behavior while preparing individuals for their eventual return to the community. Both institutions operated according to principles that balanced public safety with respect for individual rights and human dignity. During his nighttime rounds, Thomas often reflected on the weight of history that these buildings carried, the accumulated impact of thousands of legal proceedings that had shaped the community's understanding of justice and its approach to addressing criminal behavior. The empty courtrooms and quiet corridors held memories of dramatic trials and routine hearings, high-profile cases and everyday disputes that had all contributed to the ongoing development of legal precedent and community standards. The courthouse plaza, where Thomas concluded each round of his security patrol, provided a physical connection between the judicial system and the broader community that it served. During the day, the plaza was often filled with people coming and going from court proceedings, attorneys meeting with clients, and family members providing support to those involved in legal disputes. At night, the plaza took on a different character, becoming a quiet space for reflection on the role that these institutions played in maintaining social order and resolving conflicts according to established principles of law and justice. The bronze statue of Justice, blindfolded and holding scales, stood as a constant reminder of the ideals that guided the work conducted within these buildings. The statue had been installed during the Fay courthouse's construction in 1923, and it had witnessed nearly a century of social change. while remaining constant in its symbolic representation of impartial justice. The blindfold represented the principle that legal decisions should be based on evidence and law rather than irrelevant factors like race, social status, or political affiliation. The scales held by the statue symbolized the careful weighing of evidence that characterized judicial proceedings, the deliberate process of examining competing claims and arguments to reach decisions based on facts and legal principles rather than emotion or prejudice. The courthouse had served this function for generations of community members, providing a forum where conflicts could be resolved through reason rather than force. Thomas had come to appreciate the profound importance of these institutions in maintaining the social fabric that made civilized life possible. The courthouse and jail represented society's commitment to addressing conflicts and criminal behavior through established processes that respected both individual rights and community needs. The night shift at these facilities required a different kind of vigilance than the busy activity of court days, a quiet attention to the ongoing functions that continued even when the buildings appeared to be empty. Security systems monitored every corridor and room, ensuring that the valuable records and equipment housed in these buildings remained safe from theft or damage. The heating and ventilation systems that maintained comfortable conditions in the courtrooms and offices operated continuously, preserving the documents and equipment that were essential to the judicial process. The computer systems that maintained court records and schedules required ongoing monitoring to ensure that technical problems did not disrupt court proceedings. Emergency systems stood ready to respond to fire, medical emergencies, or security threats that might arise even during the quiet hours when the buildings were largely unoccupied. Thomas carried communication equipment that connected him to police, fire, and medical emergency services, ensuring that help could be summoned quickly if needed. The responsibility of protecting these institutions extended beyond physical security to encompass preservation of the integrity and dignity that made effective judicial proceedings possible. The courthouse had to remain a place where citizens could have confidence that their legal disputes would be handled fairly and professionally, according to established principles of due process and equal justice under law. This confidence was built through decades of consistent, professional operation that had earned the respect of attorneys, judges, and community members who participated in legal proceedings. The physical buildings provided the foundation for this institutional credibility, but the real source of public trust was the quality of the work conducted within these walls. As Thomas completed his rounds and prepared for the changing of the guard with the day shift security staff, he reflected on his role as a guardian of these institutions during their hours of rest. The courthouse and jail would soon fill again with the sounds and activity of daily operations. But the quiet hours of night provided essential time for these buildings to prepare for another day of serving the community's needs for justice and security. The transition from night to day was gradual in these buildings, beginning with the arrival of maintenance staff, who ensured that courtrooms and offices were clean and properly prepared for the day's proceedings. Custodial staff took pride in maintaining these public buildings to the highest standards, understanding that the physical environment contributed to the dignity and effectiveness of judicial proceedings. Court clerks arrived early to review the day's schedule and ensure that all necessary documents and materials were properly organized for judges and attorneys. The clerk's office served as the administrative heart of the courthouse, coordinating the complex logistics that made multiple simultaneous proceedings possible. Security personnel increased their presence as judges, attorneys, and members of the public began arriving for the day's court sessions. The security screening process at the courthouse entrance was designed to ensure safety while respecting the constitutional right of public access to judicial proceedings. The courthouse parking lot gradually filled with the vehicles of those who had business before the court, attorneys carrying briefcases filled with legal documents, family members arriving to support loved ones involved in legal proceedings, and jurors reporting for duty in the democratic process of justice. As the buildings came alive with daily activity, Thomas completed his final security reports and prepared to leave these institutions in the capable hands of those who would carry on their essential work throughout another day. The courthouse and jail would continue their vital functions, processing new cases and managing ongoing ones, according to established procedures that had been refined through decades of experience. The night shift had provided these buildings with the rest and preparation they needed to continue serving the community's need for justice, security, and conflict resolution. The quiet hours had allowed essential maintenance and security functions to continue while preserving the dignity and order that made effective judicial proceedings possible. The empty courtrooms would soon fill with the voices of attorneys, witnesses, and judges working through the complex process of determining facts and applying law to resolve human conflicts. The jail would continue its functions of secure custody and rehabilitation programming designed to prepare inmates for successful reintegration into the community. These buildings stood as monuments to the community's commitment to addressing crime and conflict through established legal processes rather than through violence or arbitrary power. They represented the accumulated wisdom of generations of legal professionals who had worked to refine and improve the administration of justice while maintaining respect for individual rights and human dignity. The morning sun, streaming through the tall windows of the courthouse, illuminated the bronze statue of justice and cast new shadows across the plaza, where citizens would soon gather to participate in the ongoing work of democracy and law. The buildings were ready for another day of serving the community's needs, restored by the quiet hours of night and prepared to continue their essential role in maintaining social order through justice rather than force. Maple Street stretched for 6 blocks through the heart of the Riverside district, lined with modest single-family homes that had housed generations of working families since their construction in the 1940s. Social worker Elena Vasquez had walked these sidewalks countless times over her 12-year career, visiting families whose lives had been touched by crime in ways both obvious and subtle, carrying with her the understanding that every incident rippled outward through communities in patterns that extended far beyond the immediate victims and perpetrators. The houses on Maple Street told stories through their details, the carefully tended gardens that spoke of stability and hope, the toys scattered in front yards that indicated young families establishing their roots, the ramps and handrails that showed how households had adapted to accommodate aging family members who had chosen to remain in neighborhoods they had helped build over decades. Number 1247. Maple Street was home to the Morrison family, where Alina had first visited 3 years earlier following a domestic violence incident that had resulted in the arrest of Robert Morrison and temporary placement of his 2 children with their grandmother. The house, a small bungalow with white siding and green shutters, had been carefully maintained despite the financial and emotional stress that had affected the family during Robert's struggle with alcoholism and unemployment. Elena's initial reports had documented a household in crisis, with Patricia Morrison attempting to maintain stability for her children while dealing with her husband's increasingly erratic behavior and their mounting financial difficulties. The children, 8-year-old Michael and 6-year-old Sarah, had been showing signs of stress that were affecting their performance in school and their relationships with other children in the neighborhood. The case had required Elena to coordinate services from multiple agencies while also working directly with the Morrison family to address the underlying issues that had contributed to the domestic violence incident. Robert Morrison had been required to attend alcohol treatment and anger management counseling, while Patricia Morrison had received support services that helped her develop safety planning and financial management skills. The children had received counseling through the county's Child and Family Services program, working with therapists who specialized in helping young people process traumatic experiences and develop coping strategies for dealing with family stress. Elena had facilitated these services while also monitoring the family's progress and ensuring that the children's safety remained the primary consideration in all decisions about family reunification. Over the 3 years since the initial incident, Elena had watched the Morrison family slowly rebuild their relationships and develop healthier patterns of communication and conflict resolution. Robert Morrison had successfully completed his treatment programs and had found steady employment at a local manufacturing plant, while Patricia Morrison had returned to school to complete her nursing degree with support from educational assistance programs. The children had shown remarkable resilience, benefiting from the counseling services and the increased stability in their home environment. Michael had joined the neighborhood Little League team and had developed friendships with other children on the block, while Sarah had begun taking piano lessons from Mrs. Chun next door, who had offered to teach her as part of the informal support network that had developed around the Morrison family. Elena's most recent visit to the Morrison household had been a routine follow-up rather than a crisis intervention, an opportunity to observe the family's continued progress and to ensure that the support systems they had developed were sustainable in the long term. The house had felt different during this visit, characterized by a calm energy that spoke to the hard work that all family members had done to heal from their earlier trauma. The Morrison case exemplified the complex ways that crime affected families and communities, extending far beyond the immediate incident to influence children's development, family relationships, economic stability, and community connections. Elena's work had required understanding not just the legal and safety issues involved in domestic violence, but also the social and economic factors that had contributed to the family's stress and the resources available to support their recovery. 2 blocks away, at 1456 Maple Street, Elena had worked with another family whose lives had been affected by crime in a different, but equally complex way. The Foster household consisted of grandmother Dorothy Foster, who was raising her 3 grandchildren after their parents had been incarcerated on drug-related charges. The children, ages 7, 9, and 11, had come to live with Mrs. Foster after spending several months in foster care while relatives were located and assessed for their ability to provide stable homes. Mrs. Foster, a 68-year-old retired school secretary, had welcomed her grandchildren despite the significant challenges that caring for 3 young children presented at her age and on her limited retirement income. Elena's initial assessment had identified multiple needs, including financial assistance, educational support for the children, and help with navigating the legal system as Mrs. Foster worked to establish permanent custody arrangements. The children had arrived at their grandmother's house, carrying emotional trauma from witnessing their parents' drug use and arrest, followed by the uncertainty and displacement of temporary foster care placements. Elena had arranged counseling services for all 3 children, while also working with their schools to ensure they received appropriate academic support as they adjusted to their new living situation. Mrs. Foster had proven to be a remarkably dedicated caregiver, but she had needed assistance in understanding how to access community resources and navigate the complex systems that could provide support for her family. Elena had helped her apply for kinship care payments that supplemented her retirement income, had connected her with legal aid services that assisted with custody proceedings, and had arranged for respite care that gave Mrs. Foster occasional breaks from her caregiving responsibilities. The transformation of the Foster household over 2 years had been gradual but profound. The children had slowly adjusted to the stability and safety of their grandmother's home, with their academic performance improving and their behavioral problems decreasing as they developed trust in their new living situation. Mrs. Foster had connected with other grandparents in similar situations through a support group that met at the local community center, creating a network of mutual assistance and understanding. Elena had been particularly moved by the way the Foster family had been embraced by their neighbors on Maple Street, with several households offering practical help and emotional support that had eased the transition for both Mrs. Foster and the children. Mrs. Anderson from next door had begun including the Foster children in her weekly baking sessions, while Mr. Rodriguez from across the street had volunteered to help with yard work and minor home repairs. This informal support network had complemented the formal services that Elena had arranged, creating a comprehensive safety net that addressed both the family's practical needs and their need for social connection and community belonging. The children had developed friendships with other children in the neighborhood, participating in informal street games and organized activities that had helped them feel like they belonged in their new community. The neighborhood's response to the Foster family had reflected a broader pattern that Elena had observed throughout her work in the Riverside district, a tendency for residents to rally around families in crisis and provide support that extended far beyond what formal social services could offer. This community response was not universal or automatic, but when it occurred, it significantly enhanced the effectiveness of professional interventions and contributed to more positive outcomes for families affected by crime. At 1623 Maple Street, Elena had encountered a different type of case when she was asked to conduct a home assessment for 16-year-old David Martinez, who had been arrested for vandalism and was being considered for a diversion program that would allow him to avoid formal prosecution if he completed community service and counseling requirements. David lived with his mother, Carmen Martinez, and his younger sister in a small house that Carmen had purchased several years earlier with assistance from a first-time homebuyer program. Carmen worked 2 part-time jobs to support her family, while also attending community college classes in the evenings to complete her degree in social work, a demanding schedule that left her with limited time for supervising her teenage son. Elena's assessment had revealed that David's vandalism incident was part of a larger pattern of behavior that reflected his struggle with the transition to adolescence, combined with the stress of living in a single-parent household where his mother was often absent due to work and school commitments. David was academically capable, but had been drawn into a peer group that engaged in minor criminal activities as a way of asserting independence and gaining social status. The home assessment had also identified several strengths in the Martinez household, including Carmen's strong commitment to her children's welfare, David's generally respectful relationship with his mother, and the family's connection to their extended family and cultural community. These strengths provided a foundation for interventions that could address David's behavioral problems while building on the positive elements in his family situation. Elena had worked with the juvenile court to develop a diversion plan that included community service at a local youth center, counseling focused on decision-making and peer pressure resistance, and a mentoring relationship with a volunteer from the community. The plan also included support for Carmen Martinez, helping her access after-school programs for her daughter and flexible work, arrangements that would allow her to be more available for supervision and support of her son. The Martinez case had demonstrated the importance of understanding juvenile crime within the context of family systems and community resources, rather than simply as individual behavioral problems requiring punishment. David's vandalism had been a symptom of larger stresses affecting his family, and effective intervention had required addressing those underlying issues, while also holding him accountable for his actions. 6 months after the initial incident, Elena's follow-up assessment had documented significant improvement in David's behavior and family relationships. He had completed his community service requirements and had developed a positive relationship with his mentor. While his grades had improved and he had begun participating in organized sports activities that provided positive alternatives to the peer group that had influenced his earlier poor decisions. Carmen Martinez had successfully completed her degree and had found full-time employment in her field, allowing her to reduce her work schedule while increasing her income and her availability for her children. The family had maintained their connections to extended family and community, organizations that provided ongoing support and cultural grounding for both children. Elena's work in the Riverside district had taught her to recognize the subtle signs of how crime affected entire neighborhoods, not just the immediate victims and perpetrators. She had observed how a series of break-ins could change the social dynamics of a street, with neighbors becoming more suspicious of strangers and less likely to allow their children to play outside unsupervised. She had seen how domestic violence in one household could affect children throughout a neighborhood who witnessed or heard the incidents and worried about their own family safety. The relationship between crime and community health was complex and bidirectional, with social problems contributing to increased crime while crime itself undermined the social cohesion that helped communities address their problems effectively. Elena's work involved trying to strengthen the positive forces within neighborhoods while also addressing the specific problems that brought individual families to the attention of social services. At 1789 Maple Street, Elena had worked with the Kowalski family after their teenage daughter Jennifer had been the victim of a sexual assault that had occurred while she was walking home from school. The case had required Elena to coordinate multiple services while also supporting a family that was struggling to process a traumatic experience that had shattered their sense of safety and normalcy. Jennifer Kowalski had been 15 years old when she was attacked by a stranger in broad daylight while walking through a park that she had used as a shortcut between school and home for several years. The assault had been interrupted by a passerby, preventing more serious physical harm, but the psychological trauma had been severe for both Jennifer and her family. Elena's initial involvement had focused on ensuring that Jennifer received appropriate medical care and counseling while also helping her parents understand how to support their daughter's recovery process. The family had been overwhelmed by the criminal justice process, struggling to understand their rights and responsibilities, while also dealing with their own emotional reactions to their daughter's victimization. The impact of the assault had extended beyond Jennifer herself to affect her younger brother, who had become anxious about his own safety and guilty about his inability to protect his sister. Her parents had struggled with feelings of anger, helplessness, and self-blame, questioning decisions they had made about allowing Jennifer independence that they now feared had contributed to her victimization. Elena had arranged for family counseling that helped all members of the Kowalski household process their reactions to the assault while also developing strategies for supporting Jennifer's recovery and preventing the incident from permanently damaging their family relationships. The counseling had addressed practical issues like safety planning and communication, as well as emotional issues like guilt, anger, and fear. The community's response to Jennifer's assault had been generally supportive, with neighbors offering practical assistance and emotional support to the Kowalski family. However, Elena had also observed some problematic reactions, including suggestions that Jennifer or her parents were somehow responsible for the assault and recommendations for safety precautions that would have significantly restricted Jennifer's independence and participation in normal teenage activities. Elena had worked with the family to navigate these community reactions while focusing on Jennifer's needs and preferences regarding her own recovery process. Some neighbors had offered helpful support, such as organizing walking groups that allowed children to travel between school and home in groups rather than alone, while others had made suggestions that reflected victim blaming, attitudes that could have interfered with Jennifer's healing. The criminal justice process had been lengthy and stressful for the Kowalski family, requiring Jennifer to testify about her traumatic experience while also living with the uncertainty about whether her attacker would be convicted and what sentence he might receive. Elena had advocated for victim services that helped the family understand the court process and provided support during court appearances and other legal proceedings. 2 years after the assault, Elena's follow-up with the Kowalski family had found that Jennifer had shown remarkable resilience in her recovery, returning to school and social activities while maintaining appropriate caution about her personal safety. The family had used their experience to become advocates for improved lighting and security in the park where the assault had occurred, working with city officials and neighborhood organizations to implement changes that would reduce the risk of similar incidents. Elena's work with crime-affected families had given her a deep appreciation for the resilience that individuals and communities could demonstrate when provided with appropriate support and resources. She had observed families recovering from traumatic experiences, neighborhoods organizing to address safety concerns, and individuals making positive changes in their lives after criminal justice involvement. However, she had also seen how crime could create lasting damage when appropriate support was not available or when community responses were ineffective or harmful. Families could be torn apart by the stress of criminal justice involvement. Neighborhoods could become fragmented by fear and suspicion, and individuals could become trapped in cycles of criminal behavior that seemed impossible to break. The difference between positive and negative outcomes often depended on factors that extended far beyond the specific criminal incident itself. Families with strong social support networks, adequate financial resources, and access to quality services were much more likely to recover successfully from criminal victimization or justice system involvement than those who lacked these advantages. Elena's role involved trying to connect families with the resources and support they needed, while also advocating for systemic changes that would make those resources more widely available and more effective. She had participated in community planning processes that addressed neighborhood safety concerns, had testified before county commissioners about the need for expanded victim services, and had collaborated with law enforcement agencies to develop more family-friendly approaches to criminal investigations. The Riverside District had changed significantly during Elena's 12 years of work in the area, with some changes reflecting positive community development and others indicating ongoing challenges that required continued attention. New businesses had opened along the main commercial strip, providing employment opportunities and services that strengthened the local economy, while housing rehabilitation programs had helped homeowners maintain and improve their properties. However, the neighborhood had also experienced challenges related to economic inequality, substance abuse, and family instability that contributed to ongoing crime problems and created stress for many residents. Elena had observed how these larger social issues affected individual families, creating circumstances that increased the risk of criminal behavior or victimization, while also making recovery more difficult when crimes did occur. Her work had convinced her that effective crime prevention required addressing these underlying social conditions rather than simply responding to criminal incidents after they occurred. The families she worked with needed not just crisis intervention services, but also access to quality education, stable employment, affordable health care, and safe housing that would provide the foundation for healthy community life. The informal support networks that existed in neighborhoods, like the Riverside District, represented an important but often overlooked resource for crime prevention and recovery. Elena had observed how neighbors who knew and cared about each other were more likely to notice signs of problems early and to provide assistance that prevented minor issues from escalating into serious crises. These informal networks were most effective when they were supported by formal institutions and services that provided backup resources and professional expertise when needed. The combination of community caring and professional competence created the strongest foundation for helping families affected by crime while also preventing future incidents through early intervention and community-based support. As Alina walked through the Riverside district during her regular visits to client families, she carried with her the accumulated wisdom of hundreds of cases that had taught her about the complex relationships between individual behavior, family dynamics, community resources, and larger social conditions. Each family she worked with was unique in its specific circumstances and needs, but patterns emerged that informed her understanding of how to most effectively help families affected by crime. The tree-lined streets of the Riverside district held countless stories of challenge and resilience, of families that had faced difficult circumstances and found ways to heal and grow stronger. These stories were not always dramatic or newsworthy, but they represented the real work of community building and family preservation that formed the foundation of healthy neighborhoods and effective crime prevention. Alina's car moved slowly through the district as she concluded her visits for the day. Past houses where families were preparing dinner, children were playing in yards, and neighbors were chatting across fence lines. The ordinary rhythms of community life continued, supported by the less visible work of social workers, police officers, teachers, and countless volunteers who helped families navigate the challenges that every community faced in maintaining safety, stability, and hope for the future. The central police station settled into its quieter rhythm after midnight, when the urgent calls of the day shift gave way to the steadier pulse of night patrol and the soft mechanical sounds that formed the backdrop of law enforcement's continuous vigil. Sergeant Patricia Kim had worked the night desk for 8 years, and she had grown to appreciate the particular atmosphere that descended over the station during these hours, when paperwork became meditation and the most important work often involved simply bearing witness to the accumulated weight of human experience. Desk Sergeant Station occupied the heart of the building's main floor, positioned so that Patricia could monitor radio traffic, assist officers returning from calls, and manage the steady flow of documentation that transformed the chaos of street-level police work into organized records that would become part of the department's institutional memory. The desk itself was scarred and worn from decades of use, its surface marked by coffee rings and the indentations left by countless pens pressing through multiple layers of carbon paper. Above Patricia's head, the old electric clock that had hung on the wall since the station's construction in 1962 marked time with a gentle, mechanical tick that became almost inaudible during busy periods but seemed to echo through the building during the quiet hours of deep night. The clock's face, yellowed slightly with age, showed not just the current time, but the passage of all the nights that had come before, each one bringing its own collection of human dramas that required careful documentation and patient response. The radio carried the intermittent conversations between patrol officers and dispatch, voices that maintained professional composure while dealing with situations that tested their training and experience. Patricia had learned to interpret the subtle variations in tone and cadence that indicated when an officer was handling a routine matter versus when they were dealing with something more complex or potentially dangerous. Officer Rodriguez's voice came through the radio with the steady calm that characterized his approach to police work. Requesting a report number for a minor traffic accident at the intersection of Main and Elm, his words were economical and precise, conveying the essential information while maintaining the radio protocol that ensured clear communication even when multiple units were operating simultaneously. Patricia assigned the report number and made the initial entry in the incident log, beginning the paper trail that would follow this minor accident through investigation, insurance claims, and eventual filing in the archives. The accident itself would probably be forgotten by most people within a few days, but the documentation would preserve the details that might become important later if questions arose about traffic patterns, road conditions, or vehicle safety. The incident log was a leather-bound book that had recorded thousands of police calls over the past several years. Its pages filled with brief summaries written in the careful handwriting of different desk sergeants working different shifts. Each entry contained the essential facts: time, location, nature of call, responding officers, but together they formed a comprehensive record of the department's daily contact with the community. It served. Patricia opened the log to the current page and made the entry for Officer Rodriguez's accident call, her pen moving across the lined paper with the automatic precision that came from years of practice. The writing itself had become a kind of meditation, a way of transforming the raw material of human conflict and crisis into something that could be understood, analyzed, and filed away. 20 minutes later, Officer Chun's voice requested assistance with a domestic disturbance on Pine Street, and Patricia could hear in his tone the particular mix of caution and patience that these calls required. Domestic situations were unpredictable in ways that made them challenging for responding officers, involving family dynamics and emotional tensions that could escalate quickly or resolve peacefully depending on factors that were often impossible to predict in advance. Patricia dispatched Officer Martinez as backup and made the appropriate entries in both the incident log and the dispatch record, creating multiple paper trails that would help supervisors track officer safety and workload distribution throughout the shift. The paperwork served not just administrative purposes, but also officer safety functions, ensuring that supervisors always knew where their personnel were located and what kinds of situations they were handling. The domestic disturbance call required more extensive documentation than the traffic accident, with initial reports from both responding officers followed by witness statements, photographs of any evidence, and coordination with social services if children were involved in the household. Patricia prepared the necessary forms and report numbers, anticipating the documentation that would flow back to her desk over the following hours. The station's coffee pot gurgled quietly in the corner of the room, brewing the strong coffee that sustained night shift operations and provided a small comfort during the long hours when the building felt isolated from the sleeping city around it. Patricia had learned to judge the passage of time by the coffee pot cycles, each fresh pot marking another segment of the night's progression toward dawn. Detective Walsh emerged from the detective bureau carrying a thick file folder and approached Patricia's desk with the deliberate pace that characterized his approach to police work. He had been working late on a burglary investigation that had generated extensive paperwork, trying to connect several incidents that appeared to be related but required careful analysis to establish the patterns that would guide the investigation. The Detective Bureau maintained its own rhythm during night hours, with investigators using the quieter time to review case files, analyze evidence, and prepare reports that required concentrated attention to detail. Detective Walsh had spread the contents of his case file across his desk, creating a visual map of the burglary series that helped him identify connections between different incidents. Patricia processed Detective Walsh's request for additional report numbers and made the entries that would cross-reference his investigation with the original incident reports filed by patrol officers. This coordination between different divisions of the department was essential for effective case management, ensuring that information flowed properly between the officers who responded to initial calls and the detectives who conducted follow-up investigations. The burglary series that Detective Walsh was investigating had affected residents throughout the West Side District, creating a pattern of property crimes that required both immediate response to individual incidents and longer-term analysis to identify the perpetrator and prevent future occurrences. Each burglary had been documented with crime scene photographs, witness statements, and detailed inventories of stolen property, creating a comprehensive record that could be analyzed for patterns and connections. Welsh's investigation exemplified the methodical approach that characterized effective police work, moving systematically through the available evidence while remaining open to new information that might change the direction of the investigation. His reports documented not just the facts of each case, but also his reasoning process, creating a record that could be reviewed by supervisors and could guide other investigators who might work on similar cases. The night shift provided ideal conditions for this kind of analytical work, with fewer interruptions and distractions, allowing investigators to maintain the sustained concentration that complex cases required. Detective Walsh had learned to use the quiet hours productively, knowing that thorough preparation during night shifts often led to breakthroughs that might not be possible during the busier pace of day operations. Patricia's radio crackled with another call, this one from Officer Foster reporting a possible break-in at Morrison's hardware store on Commercial Street. The officer's voice carried the heightened alertness that came with investigating potential crimes in progress, requiring immediate backup and careful coordination to ensure both officer safety and preservation of evidence. Patricia dispatched additional units to the scene and notified the Detective Bureau about the possible break-in, knowing that Detective Walsh would want to determine whether this incident might be connected to his ongoing burglary investigation. The preliminary coordination between patrol and detective functions was crucial for effective case management, preventing important connections from being missed during the initial response phase. The hardware store break-in would generate its own extensive paperwork trail, beginning with the initial response reports and expanding to include crime scene processing, evidence collection, witness interviews, and coordination with the store owner and insurance investigators. Patricia prepared the necessary forms and began the documentation that would track this investigation through its various phases. Officer Foster's subsequent RADIO reports provided updates on the investigation's progress, describing evidence of forced entry and the apparent theft of power tools and other merchandise. The methodical way he described his observations reflected training that emphasized careful documentation of crime scenes, understanding that details that seemed minor at the time of initial response might become crucial for successful prosecution. The hardware store case would likely be assigned to Detective Walsh, given its potential connection to the ongoing burglary series, creating additional work for an investigation that was already generating substantial documentation. Patricia coordinated the assignment process, ensuring that the case file would be properly transferred and that all relevant information would be available for the detective's review. As the night progressed, Patricia found herself reflecting on the way that police work had evolved during her 8 years on the night desk. The fundamental nature of the job remained the same: responding to calls for help, investigating crimes, maintaining public safety, but the documentation requirements had become more sophisticated, reflecting both legal requirements and improved understanding of effective law enforcement practices. The computer systems that had been installed several years earlier had streamlined some aspects of record keeping, while creating new requirements for data entry and case tracking. Patricia had learned to use these systems efficiently, but she still appreciated the tactile satisfaction of writing in the incident log, maintaining a physical record that provided backup for electronic systems and preserved the human element in police documentation. The incident log served as a kind of daily diary for the police department, recording not just major crimes, but also the routine calls that made up the majority of police work: welfare checks, noise complaints, traffic stops, and community assistance calls that never made headlines, but demonstrated the department's ongoing engagement with community life. Reading through the previous night's entries in the incident log, Patricia could reconstruct the rhythm of the shift, seeing how calls had clustered during certain hours and how officers had been deployed to handle multiple situations simultaneously. The log provided a comprehensive picture of police activity that was useful for resource planning and shift scheduling, but it also served as a historical record of community life and the challenges that residents faced. Officer Martinez's voice came through the radio requesting the supervisor for the domestic disturbance call on Pine Street, indicating that the situation had developed complications that required additional authority or expertise. Patricia contacted Sergeant Morrison, who was conducting patrol supervision, and updated the incident log to reflect the supervisor's response to the scene. Domestic disturbance calls often required supervisory involvement because of their complexity and the potential for escalation, with family dynamics and emotional tensions creating situations that exceeded the scope of routine police response. Supervisors brought additional training and experience to these situations, helping to ensure that all legal requirements were met while also addressing the underlying problems that had led to police involvement. The paperwork generated by domestic disturbance calls was particularly extensive, requiring careful documentation of statements from all parties involved, photographs of any evidence, coordination with social services or victim advocacy groups, and follow-up reports that tracked the case through the court system if charges were filed. Patricia prepared the additional forms that would be needed for supervisory review and made the entries that would ensure proper case tracking through the various agencies that might become involved. The coordination between police, social services, and the court system was essential for effective response to domestic violence, but it also created significant documentation requirements that had to be managed carefully to ensure that nothing was overlooked. The coffee pot finished another cycle, and Patricia refilled her cup while monitoring radio traffic and reviewing the paperwork that had accumulated during the evening. The steady rhythm of documentation had created a substantial pile of forms and reports that would need to be processed and filed before the end of her shift. Detective Walsh returned to Patricia's desk with completed reports from his burglary investigation. Having spent several hours analyzing the evidence and preparing documentation that would guide the next phase of the investigation, his reports were models of thorough police work, containing detailed descriptions of evidence, careful analysis of patterns, and clear recommendations for follow-up investigation. The detective's methodical approach to documentation reflected his understanding that successful prosecution often depended on the quality of police reports, with attorneys and judges relying on written documentation to understand complex cases and make informed decisions. Detective Walsh had learned to write his reports as if they would be read by people who had no direct knowledge of the case, providing sufficient detail and context to support legal proceedings that might occur months or years after the initial investigation. Patricia processed Detective Walsh's reports and made the necessary entries in the case tracking system, ensuring that the investigation would be properly monitored and that supervisors would be informed about its progress. The case management system helped prevent important cases from being overlooked and ensured that investigations received appropriate resources and attention. The hardware store break-in had been cleared by Officer Foster, who reported that the scene had been processed and that the case was ready for detective assignment. Patricia coordinated the transfer of the case file to Detective Walsh and updated the tracking system to reflect the new assignment, maintaining the paper trail that would connect all aspects of the investigation. As the night shift moved toward its final hours, Patricia began the process of preparing the daily reports that would summarize the shift's activities for supervisory review and administrative planning. These reports aggregated information from individual incident reports, creating statistical summaries that tracked crime trends, officer workload, and resource utilization. The daily reports served multiple purposes, providing information for immediate operational decisions while also contributing to longer-term planning and policy development. Patterns that emerged from daily reporting could indicate emerging crime trends, resource needs, or training requirements that required administrative attention. Patricia's role in the report preparation process was crucial because of her oversight of all night shift activities and her access to the detailed information contained in individual case files. Her experience allowed her to identify patterns and connections that might not be apparent from statistical summaries alone, providing context that helped supervisors understand the human dynamics behind the numbers. The night shift had processed 17 calls for service, ranging from the routine traffic accident to the more complex domestic disturbance and burglary investigations. Each call had generated its own documentation, but together they provided a comprehensive picture of police activity and community needs during the overnight hours. The documentation from the night shift would be reviewed by day shift supervisors, incorporated into ongoing investigations, and filed in the archives where it would become part of the department's institutional memory. The reports that seemed routine at the time they were written might become crucial evidence in future investigations or provide historical context for understanding crime patterns and community development. As dawn approached and the day shift personnel began arriving for their briefing, Patricia completed her final entries in the incident log and prepared the desk for transfer to her day shift counterpart. The transition between shifts required careful coordination to ensure that ongoing cases received proper attention and that important information was not lost during the handover process. The night desk had served as the coordination hub for all police activity during the overnight hours, managing communications, processing documentation, and maintaining the records that supported effective law enforcement operations. Patricia's work had created the foundation for follow-up investigations, court proceedings, and administrative planning that would continue long after her shift had ended. The accumulated paperwork from the night shift represented more than bureaucratic requirements. It documented the department's ongoing engagement with community life and its commitment to maintaining detailed records that could support both immediate operational needs and longer-term accountability to the public it served. The fluorescent lights that had hummed overhead throughout the night would soon be supplemented by natural daylight streaming through the station windows, marking the transition from the contemplative pace of night operations to the more urgent rhythm of day shift activities. But the work that had been accomplished during the quiet hours, the careful documentation, the methodical investigation, the patient coordination of resources, provided the foundation for everything that would follow. Patricia gathered her personal belongings and prepared to leave the station, satisfied with another night of maintaining the careful records that made effective police work possible. The night shift had fulfilled its essential function of providing continuous service to the community while creating the documentation that would preserve institutional knowledge and support the ongoing mission of law enforcement. Evidence technician Maria Santos pulled the thin chain of the basement lamp, casting a warm circle of light over the metal table where thousands of photographs lay organized in careful chronological sequence. The evidence processing unit had occupied this basement space for 37 years, and Maria had spent the last 15 of those years cataloging, preserving, and occasionally revisiting the visual documentation of crimes that had long since been resolved. Their urgency dissolved into the patient work of historical preservation. The photographs from the 1970s had acquired the particular quality that time gave to all analog images, their colors shifting toward warmer tones as the chemical emulsions aged, creating an almost dreamlike atmosphere around scenes that had once represented immediate crisis and urgent investigation. What had been stark black and white crime scene documentation or vivid color evidence, photos had mellowed into something that resembled old family portraits, gentle in their sepia tones despite the serious nature of their content. Box 74156 contained photographs from a burglary investigation that had captivated the community during the summer of 1974, when a series of break-ins at local businesses had prompted the formation of a neighborhood watch program and had led to the installation of the police department's first comprehensive security camera system. The photographs documented not just the crime scenes themselves, but the community response that had grown around the investigation, creating a visual record of how collective concern had transformed individual victimization into collaborative problem solving. The first photograph in the series showed the exterior of Morrison's Five and Dime, taken on a bright Tuesday morning after the overnight break-in had been discovered by the store owner. The image captured the pristine ordinariness of small-town commercial life: wide sidewalks, angled parking spaces, and large plate glass windows that had been designed to welcome customers rather than deter criminals. The only indication of the crime was the small piece of police tape visible at the corner of the frame and the careful positioning of evidence, markers that had been placed by the investigating Officer. Maria had learned to read these old photographs like historical documents, understanding that they preserve not just evidence of specific crimes, but also glimpses of community life from earlier eras. The clothing worn by bystanders, the design of storefronts, the models of cars parked along the street, all of these details provided context that helped her understand how the community had evolved over the decades since these images were captured. The interior photographs from Morrison's Five and Dime showed the methodical approach that had characterized crime scene processing in that era, with evidence markers placed next to items that had been disturbed and careful attention paid to documenting the path that the burglar had taken through the store. The investigating officer had photographed not just obvious evidence, but also undisturbed areas, creating a comprehensive visual record that allowed investigators to understand exactly what had happened during the break-in. Detective James Foster had led the investigation, and his photographic documentation reflected the thorough approach that had characterized his 25-year career with the department. Each photograph had been carefully composed to show maximum detail, while maintaining the proper perspective for courtroom presentation, with evidence markers clearly visible and scale references included to allow accurate measurement of distances and dimensions. The store's interior, as captured in these photographs, revealed the particular character of small-town retail establishments from that era: wooden floors worn smooth by decades of customer traffic, glass display cases filled with merchandise arranged for maximum visual appeal, and hand-lettered signs that reflected the personal attention that local business owners brought to their enterprises. The burglar had shown unusual selectivity in choosing items to steal, taking cash from the register but leaving behind merchandise that would have been easy to carry and valuable to fence. Detective Foster's photographs documented this selectivity carefully, showing untouched displays adjacent to areas where specific items had been removed, suggesting that the perpetrator had been looking for particular things, rather than simply grabbing whatever was available. The pause available investigation had expanded to include several other local businesses that had experienced similar break-ins, and Detective Foster's photographic documentation had revealed patterns that connected the different crime scenes. The burglar had consistently entered through rear doors or windows, had shown similar selectivity in choosing items to steal, and had been careful to avoid damaging property unnecessarily. Maria found a photograph from the community meeting that had been organized in response to the burglary series, showing the packed auditorium of the Riverside Community Center where business owners, residents, and police officials had gathered to discuss security improvements and neighborhood watch programs. The photograph captured the concerned faces of community members who had been genuinely frightened by the break-ins but were determined to work together to address the problem. Police Chief William Thompson stood at the podium in the center of the photograph, gesturing toward a map that showed the locations of the various break-ins. His serious expression and formal posture reflected the gravity with which the department had approached the community's concerns, while the attentive faces in the audience demonstrated the civic engagement that had characterized community response to crime in that era. The community meeting had led to the formation of the Riverside Neighborhood Watch, one of the first organized crime prevention programs in the county's history. Subsequent photographs documented the training sessions where volunteers learned to recognize suspicious activity and coordinate with police patrols, creating a partnership between law enforcement and community members that had become a model for similar programs throughout the region. Maria turned to photographs from the resolution of the burglary case, which had concluded 3 months after the initial break-ins when Detective Foster had arrested 17-year-old Michael Harrison, whose family had been struggling with financial difficulties, and whose older brother had been encouraging him to steal items that could be sold to help support the household. The arrest photograph showed young Michael Harrison standing next to Detective Foster outside the police station, but the image had been composed in a way that preserved the teenager's dignity while documenting the legal process. Detective Foster had understood that the arrest represented not just law enforcement success, but also a family crisis that required sensitive handling to prevent long-term damage to a young person who had made poor decisions under difficult circumstances. The case had been resolved through a combination of prosecution and community service, with Michael Harrison required to make restitution to the victimized businesses while also participating in a mentoring program that connected him with local business owners who provided guidance and eventually employment. The final photographs in the series showed Michael working at Thompson's hardware store, where he had been hired part-time while completing his high school education. Vox 76298 contained photographs from a missing person case that had mobilized the entire community during the autumn of 1976, when 8-year-old Amanda Foster had disappeared while walking home from school and had not been found for 3 days despite extensive search efforts by police, volunteers, and specialized rescue teams. The initial photographs documented the organized search effort that had covered several square miles of rural area surrounding the town, with volunteers organized into systematic search teams that had combed through wooded areas, abandoned buildings, and agricultural land that might have concealed a missing child. The images showed the methodical approach that had been used to ensure that no potential location was overlooked, while also preserving any evidence that might have been relevant if the disappearance had involved criminal activity. Maria had always been moved by the photographs from the Amanda Foster search, which captured both the urgency of the situation and the remarkable community response that had brought together hundreds of volunteers who had suspended their normal activities to participate in the search effort. The photographs showed farmers leaving their fields to join search teams, business owners closing their stores to provide food and supplies for searchers, and school children contributing artwork and prayers that had been displayed at the command post. Search coordinator Lieutenant Sarah Walsh had documented the operation with photographs that showed the complex logistics involved in managing a large-scale search effort while maintaining the careful evidence protocols that would be necessary if the case had involved criminal activity. The command post, established in the parking lot of Riverside Elementary School, had been equipped with maps, communication equipment, and coordination systems that allowed effective management of dozens of separate search teams. The photographs from the search effort also documented the emotional toll that the missing child case had taken on the community, with images showing the exhausted faces of searchers who had worked through the night and the anxious expressions of Amanda's family members who had maintained hope despite the passage of time. The visual record preserved the intensity of community concern that had mobilized such an extensive response to a single family's crisis. Amanda had been found safe after 3 days. Discovered in an abandoned barn, where she had been held by a mentally disturbed individual who had convinced himself that he was protecting her from dangers that existed only in his imagination. The photographs from her rescue showed the relief and joy that had swept through the community, but they also documented the careful attention that had been paid to preserving evidence and ensuring that Amanda received appropriate medical and psychological care. The case had concluded with the perpetrator receiving mental health treatment rather than criminal prosecution, a resolution that had been supported by Amanda's family and had reflected the community's understanding that the incident had resulted from illness rather than malicious intent. The final photographs in the series showed Amanda's return to school and her participation in a ceremony honoring the volunteers who had participated in the search effort. Box 78 to 445 contained photographs from a domestic violence case that had required extensive documentation due to the severity of the injuries involved and the complexity of the family situation that had contributed to the violence. The case had been handled by Detective Margaret Chun, who had approached the investigation with particular sensitivity to the trauma experienced by all family members while ensuring that proper evidence was collected for potential prosecution. The photographs documented the physical evidence of domestic violence in ways that preserved the dignity of the victim while providing clear documentation of the injuries that had been inflicted. Detective Chun had worked with medical personnel to ensure that the photographic evidence would be admissible in court while also respecting the privacy and emotional needs of the victim during an extremely difficult period. The domestic violence photographs were among the most challenging for Maria to review, even decades after the original incident, because they documented human suffering in ways that remained powerful despite the passage of time. However, she understood the importance of preserving this evidence, both for historical purposes and as training materials that could help current investigators understand effective approaches to documenting domestic violence cases. The case had been significant in the development of the department's domestic violence protocols, leading to specialized training for officers and the establishment of partnerships with victim advocacy organizations that provided support services for families affected by domestic violence. The photographs documented not just the immediate evidence, but also the innovative approaches that Detective Chun had developed for working with domestic violence victims. Detective Chun had included photographs of the family's living situation, documenting both the evidence of violence and the normal family life that had been disrupted by the abusive behavior. These images provided context that helped prosecutors and judges understand the complex dynamics involved in domestic violence cases while also illustrating the impact that violence had on children and other family members. The resolution of the case had involved both prosecution of the perpetrator and extensive support services for the victim and her children, with follow-up photographs documenting the family's participation in counseling programs and their eventual relocation to a safer living situation. The case had demonstrated the effectiveness of comprehensive approaches to domestic violence that addressed both immediate safety needs and longer-term support for family healing. Moving to more recent additions to the photographic archive, Maria examined Box 82 to 167, which contained images from a fraud investigation that had involved multiple businesses and had required coordination between local police, state regulatory agencies, and federal investigators. The photographs documented a complex scheme that had affected dozens of local investors and had required extensive analysis of financial records and business operations. The fraud case had been led by Detective Robert Morrison, who had developed expertise in financial crimes investigation through specialized training, and had approached the case with the methodical attention to detail that complex white-collar crimes required. His photographs documented not just physical evidence, but also the paper trails and business relationships that had enabled the fraudulent scheme to operate for several years before being detected. The photographs from the fraud investigation included images of business offices, financial documents, and computer equipment that had been used to carry out the scheme. But they also documented the human impact of financial crimes on the individuals and families who had lost their savings to the fraudulent investment program. Detective Morrison had understood that successful prosecution of white-collar crimes required showing both the technical aspects of the scheme and its real-world consequences for victims. The business offices photographed during the investigation had appeared legitimate and professional, reflecting the sophisticated approach that had been used to gain victims' confidence and conceal the fraudulent nature of the investment program. The images showed well-appointed conference rooms, professional-looking financial presentations, and official documents that had been designed to create an impression of stability and success. However, Detective Morrison's careful documentation had also revealed the deceptive practices that had hidden the scheme's true nature, with photographs showing how legitimate business activities had been mixed with fraudulent transactions to create an appearance of success while actually transferring investors' money to the perpetrators' personal accounts. The fraud case had concluded with multiple convictions and the recovery of significant portions of the stolen funds, though many victims had still suffered substantial financial losses. The photographs from the case had been used not only for prosecution, but also for training materials that helped other investigators understand the techniques used in sophisticated financial fraud schemes. Maria found the fraud investigation photographs particularly interesting because they documented the evolution of white-collar crime investigation techniques and the growing importance of financial crimes in police work. The case had required coordination between multiple agencies and had involved investigative techniques that were quite different from traditional police work, reflecting the changing nature of criminal activity in an increasingly complex economic environment. Box 84 to 223 contained photographs from a series of vehicle thefts that had affected the community during the mid-1980s, when a group of teenagers had been stealing cars for joyriding rather than for resale or other profit motives. The case had been handled by Detective Patricia Walsh, who had approached the investigation with understanding of the social factors that had contributed to the juvenile crime while ensuring that appropriate consequences were imposed for the thefts. The vehicle theft photographs documented both the crimes themselves and the broader context of juvenile delinquency that had characterized the community during that period. Detective Walsh had photographed not just the recovered vehicles and evidence of theft, but also the social environments where the teenagers had been operating, providing context that helped explain how the crime pattern had developed. The photographs showed the abandoned areas where stolen vehicles had been found, often in isolated locations where the teenagers had taken them for joyriding before abandoning them when they ran out of fuel or became concerned about being caught. The images documented the minimal damage that had typically been done to the vehicles, reflecting the fact that the thefts had been motivated by excitement seeking rather than profit or malicious destruction. Detective Walsh had also photographed the community response to the vehicle thefts, including the neighborhood meetings where residents had discussed security measures and the youth programs that had been developed to provide alternative activities for teenagers who might otherwise have been attracted to criminal behavior. The photographs documented the collaborative approach that had been used to address the underlying causes of juvenile crime rather than simply responding to individual incidents. The resolution of the vehicle theft case had involved both prosecution of the teenagers involved and the development of comprehensive programs that addressed the social and economic factors that had contributed to their criminal behavior. The photographs documented the community service projects that had been required as part of the teenagers' sentences, showing them working on neighborhood improvement projects that helped repair the damage their crimes had caused to community trust and safety. As Maria continued her review of the photographic archives, she reflected on the way these images served as a comprehensive, visual history of the community's relationship with crime and law enforcement over several decades. The photographs documented not just individual criminal incidents, but also the evolution of investigative techniques, community response programs, and approaches to crime prevention that had characterized the department's work. The faded quality of the older photographs had transformed them from stark documentation of criminal activity into something more like historical art, preserving moments in time that illustrated both the persistent challenges that communities faced and the creative approaches that had been developed to address those challenges. The images had acquired a gentle quality that made them suitable for contemplative review even when their original subject matter had been urgent and disturbing. The basement archive room where Maria worked had become a kind of museum of community life, preserving visual documentation of decades of human experience that ranged from individual tragedy to collective triumph. The photographs told stories of families affected by crime, communities organizing to address safety concerns, and law enforcement officers developing innovative approaches to serving the public. Each box of photographs represented months or years of investigative work, with images that had been carefully composed and processed to serve both immediate evidentiary needs and longer-term historical preservation. The photographers who had created these images had understood that they were documenting not just criminal cases but also community history, creating a visual record that would remain valuable long after the immediate legal proceedings had been completed. The archive served multiple functions within the police department, providing historical reference materials for current investigations, training resources for new officers, and documentation that supported both academic research and community education programs. Maria's work in maintaining and organizing the photographic collection ensured that this valuable resource remained accessible and useful for various purposes. As the afternoon light faded and the basement archive room settled into its evening quiet, Maria carefully returned the photographs to their proper storage boxes and made the necessary entries in the catalog system that tracked access to archival materials. The images would rest quietly in their climate-controlled environment, preserved for future researchers and investigators who might need to understand how their community had addressed the challenges of crime and public safety in earlier eras. The photographs had completed their transformation from urgent evidence to peaceful historical documentation, their stories now told through the gentle medium of faded images that preserved human experience with the dignity that time and distance could provide. In the quiet of the archive room, these visual memories rested safely, waiting for the next person who needed to understand the accumulated wisdom of decades of dedicated police work and community response to the persistent challenges of maintaining safety and justice in a complex world. Urban planner Catherine Morrison walked slowly through the downtown district as evening shadows lengthened across the familiar streets, her trained eye reading the layers of history that had accumulated in the architecture, streetscapes, and public spaces of a city that had been her home for 43 years. In her work with the municipal planning department, Catherine had learned to see cities as living documents, their physical features preserving stories of community development, social change, and the countless human dramas that had shaped the character of neighborhoods over decades of growth and transformation. The corner of Main and Elm Street had been the site of Morrison's Five and Dime for 67 years, and the building still retained the large, plate glass windows and wide entrance that had been designed to welcome customers during an era when downtown retail districts served as the social and economic hearts of their communities. The store had closed 15 years earlier, victim of suburban shopping centers and changing consumer patterns. But the building had been carefully restored as part of a historic preservation program that recognized its importance in the city's commercial heritage. Catherine paused at the intersection, remembering the stories she had heard about the burglary series that had affected this block during the 1970s, when the downtown business community had organized one of the county's first neighborhood watch programs in response to a pattern of break-ins that had threatened the economic vitality of the district. The crimes themselves had been solved, and the perpetrators had long since served their sentences and moved on with their lives. But the community response had created lasting changes in the way local businesses approached security and collaboration. The wide sidewalks that surrounded the intersection had been designed during the 1940s to accommodate heavy pedestrian traffic during downtown's retail heyday, and they still bore the subtle marks of that era in their generous proportions and careful attention to pedestrian comfort. The streetlights that had been installed during the urban renewal projects of the 1960s had been replaced with historically appropriate fixtures that provided better illumination while maintaining the aesthetic character that made the downtown district attractive to visitors and new businesses. Catherine's work had involved documenting these physical features and understanding how they reflected the social and economic forces that had shaped the community's development over time. The downtown district represented layers of investment, planning decisions, and community priorities that could be read in the architecture, street layout, and public amenities that had been preserved or modified as the city had adapted to changing circumstances. Walking north on Main Street, Catherine passed the site where the old Riverside Hotel had stood for 82 years before being demolished in 1995 to make way for a small park that now provided green space for downtown workers and visitors. The hotel had been the scene of several significant incidents during its long history, including a fraud case in the 1980s that had involved a complex investment scheme targeting elderly residents who had been drawn to seminars held in the hotel's conference facilities. The park that had replaced the hotel preserved the memory of the site's commercial history through interpretive markers that described the role that downtown hotels had played in the community's economic development. But it also represented a conscious decision to transform a location associated with difficult memories into a space dedicated to quiet reflection and community gathering. The design had incorporated mature trees that had been relocated from other parts of the city, creating an immediate sense of established permanence that connected the new space to the neighborhood's historical character. The park's central fountain, dedicated to the memory of longtime Mayor Robert Chun, provided a focal point that drew visitors into the space, while also serving as a memorial to a public servant who had been instrumental in guiding the city through the economic transitions that had characterized the 1980s and 1990s. The fountain's design incorporated local stone and reflected the aesthetic preferences that had influenced much of the downtown renovation work, creating visual continuity that helped integrate new development with existing historical features. Catherine continued her walk along First Avenue, where the 19th century residential architecture told a different kind of story about community development and social change. The large Victorian houses that lined this street had originally been built by the merchant families, whose businesses had dominated the early commercial development of the downtown district. Their elaborate architectural details, reflecting the prosperity and social aspirations of the community's founding generation. Many of these houses had been subdivided into apartments during the economic pressures of the 1930s and 1940s, then had been gradually restored to single-family use during the historic preservation movement that had gained momentum in the 1970s and 1980s. The restoration work had been guided by historical research that documented the original appearance of the houses and the social patterns that had characterized the neighborhood. During different periods of its development, the restoration movement had been motivated partly by aesthetic and historical considerations, but it had also represented a response to crime and social problems that had affected the neighborhood when the large houses had been poorly maintained and inadequately supervised rental properties. The transformation back to owner-occupied housing had been accompanied by increased community organization and neighborhood investment that had dramatically reduced crime while restoring the area's reputation as a desirable residential district. Catherine paused in front of 412 First Avenue, a Queen Anne-style house that had been meticulously restored by Dr. Patricia Walsh and her husband over a 15-year period that had transformed one of the neighborhood's most deteriorated properties into one of its most admired examples of historical preservation. The house had required extensive structural work to address years of deferred maintenance, but the restoration had preserved original architectural details while incorporating modern conveniences that made the house suitable for contemporary family life. Asterisk. The Walsh restoration had become a model for other preservation projects in the neighborhood, demonstrating that careful attention to historical accuracy could be combined with practical considerations to create housing that served both preservation goals and current residential needs. The project had also illustrated the community benefits that could result from individual investment in neighborhood improvement, with property value increases and reduced crime following the restoration of key properties. The neighborhood's transformation had been gradual but comprehensive, with individual restoration projects combining to create a cumulative effect that had attracted new residents and businesses while also encouraging existing property owners to increase their own investments in property maintenance and improvement. The process had taken more than 20 years to complete, but it had resulted in a stable, attractive residential area that served as an example of successful historic preservation and neighborhood revitalization. Walking east toward the Riverside district, Catherine entered an area where residential development had been shaped by different economic and social forces, resulting in a neighborhood character that reflected the housing needs and financial resources of working-class families during the post-World War II era. The small single-family houses that predominated in this area had been built during the 1940s and 1950s to accommodate the housing needs of veterans and young families. Their modest size and simple architectural details reflecting both economic constraints and the optimistic social attitudes of the post-war period. The Riverside district had experienced various challenges over the decades, including periods of economic stress that had led to increased crime and social problems. But it had also demonstrated remarkable resilience and community organization that had enabled residents to address these challenges through collaborative efforts and mutual support. The neighborhood's physical characteristics had both reflected and influenced these social patterns, with features like front porches, small front yards, and narrow streets creating environments that encouraged informal social interaction and community monitoring. Catherine had worked on several planning projects in the Riverside district, including a comprehensive neighborhood plan that had been developed through extensive community consultation and had resulted in infrastructure improvements, zoning modifications, and development guidelines that supported the community's goals for maintaining its residential character while accommodating appropriate new development and business investment. The planning process had required careful attention to the community's history and the physical features that residents valued most highly, including mature street trees, walkable distances to schools and commercial services, and architectural compatibility standards that ensured new construction would complement existing neighborhood character. The plan had also addressed infrastructure needs that had been identified through resident surveys and technical analysis, resulting in street improvements, stormwater management projects, and utility upgrades that enhanced both neighborhood function and aesthetic appeal. One of the most significant planning challenges in the Riverside District had involved the site of the former Morrison manufacturing plant, which had provided employment for hundreds of local residents during its 47 years of operation before closing in 1987 due to economic restructuring that had affected manufacturing throughout the region. The plant closure had created both economic hardship for many families and a large vacant industrial site that had required careful redevelopment, planning to ensure that future uses would be compatible with the surrounding residential neighborhood. The redevelopment process had taken nearly a decade to complete, involving environmental remediation, infrastructure improvements, and extensive community consultation to develop plans that balanced economic development goals with neighborhood preservation priorities. The final redevelopment had created a mixed-use complex that included affordable housing, small-scale commercial space, and a community center that served the broader neighborhood, while providing employment opportunities that partially replaced the jobs that had been lost when the plant closed. Catherine's work on the Morrison site redevelopment had required coordination between multiple city departments, state environmental agencies, private developers, and community organizations, demonstrating the complex partnerships that were necessary for successful urban redevelopment projects. The project had also illustrated how physical planning could address social and economic challenges, with design features that encouraged community interaction and business development while preserving the residential character that existing residents valued. The community center that had been included in the Morrison site redevelopment had become a focal point for neighborhood activities and had housed various social service programs that addressed some of the ongoing challenges that affected local families. The center's programming had been developed through community input and had included after-school programs for children, job training services for adults, and meeting spaces for community organizations that had strengthened the social networks that contributed to neighborhood stability and crime prevention. Moving south toward the West Side District, Catherine entered an area where residential development had been shaped by different demographic and economic patterns, resulting in a neighborhood that included a more diverse mix of housing types and architectural styles. The West Side had been developed primarily during the 1960s and 1970s, when suburban planning principles had influenced residential design and had created neighborhoods with wider streets, larger lots, and housing that was more oriented toward automobile access than pedestrian activity. The West Side District had experienced different types of crime problems than the older, more densely developed neighborhoods closer to downtown, with property crimes like burglary and vehicle theft being more common than the interpersonal conflicts that had characterized some of the challenges in areas where housing was more closely spaced and social interaction was more frequent. The neighborhood's physical design had both contributed to these crime patterns and influenced the community response, with residents organizing patrol programs and security initiatives that took advantage of the area's street layout and sight lines. Catherine had been involved in several planning studies that had examined the relationship between neighborhood design and crime patterns, working with police department staff and community organizations to understand how physical features like street lighting, landscaping, and building placement could influence both criminal behavior and community response to crime. These studies had resulted in design guidelines that encouraged development, patterns that supported natural surveillance and community interaction while maintaining the privacy and aesthetic qualities that residents valued. The studies had also led to infrastructure improvements that enhanced both public safety and neighborhood livability, including improved street lighting, better maintenance of public spaces, and landscaping modifications that reduced opportunities for concealment, while enhancing the visual appeal of commercial and residential areas. These improvements had been implemented gradually over several years, with community input guiding priorities and design choices that reflected residents' preferences and concerns. One of the most successful community safety initiatives in the West Side District had been the establishment of a neighborhood mediation program that had provided alternatives to formal law enforcement intervention for conflicts between neighbors, and had helped address minor disputes before they escalated into more serious problems. The mediation program had been housed in a community center that had been created through the renovation of a former elementary school, with meeting rooms and program spaces that had been designed to encourage informal interaction and community problem solving. The mediation program had been staffed by trained volunteers from the neighborhood and had handled hundreds of cases over its 15-year history, addressing disputes about property maintenance, noise, parking, and other issues that had the potential to disrupt community harmony if left unresolved. The program's success had depended partly on its accessibility and informality, but it had also benefited from the physical setting that had been created in the renovated school building, with comfortable meeting spaces that had encouraged open communication and collaborative problem solving. As Catherine continued her walk through the city's neighborhoods, she reflected on the way that urban landscapes preserved and reflected the accumulated history of community life, including both the challenges that residents had faced and the creative responses that had been developed to address those challenges. The physical features of neighborhoods, their street layouts, building types, public spaces, and infrastructure served as a kind of three-dimensional archive that documented decades of planning decisions, community priorities, and social changes. The city's bridges, which Catherine crossed during her regular walks, provided particularly rich examples of how infrastructure reflected both functional needs and community values. The Riverside Bridge, built in 1952 to connect the downtown district with the residential neighborhoods on the east side of the river, had been designed with pedestrian walkways and decorative elements that reflected the community's commitment to creating infrastructure that served both practical and aesthetic purposes. The bridge had been the scene of various incidents over the years, including a suicide prevention case in 1978, where community volunteers had talked a distraught individual away from the edge, and a vandalism incident in 1980s where teenagers had spray painted graffiti on the decorative stonework before being caught by observant residents who had reported the activity to police. These incidents had become part of the bridge's history, but they had been absorbed into the larger story of a community structure that had served its essential transportation function while also providing a gathering place and landmark that contributed to the city's identity. The bridge's design had been modified over the years to address both safety concerns and changing transportation needs, with improved lighting installed during the 1980s and bicycle lanes added during the 1990s as part of a comprehensive transportation plan that had encouraged alternative modes of travel. These modifications had been made with careful attention to preserving the bridge's historical character while enhancing its functionality for contemporary users. The pedestrian areas of the bridge had become informal gathering spaces where residents could pause during their walks to enjoy views of the river and surrounding neighborhoods, creating opportunities for chance encounters and informal social interaction that contributed to community cohesion. The bridge had also become a popular location for community events and celebrations, with its central location and symbolic significance, making it an appropriate venue for activities that brought together residents from different parts of the city. The parks that had been developed along the riverfront had been designed to complement the bridge and create a continuous network of public spaces that encouraged recreational use while also providing natural areas that contributed to the city's environmental health and aesthetic appeal. These parks had been created gradually over several decades through a combination of public investment and private donations, with each addition reflecting the community's evolving understanding of the relationship between urban development and environmental preservation. The riverfront parks had also served important functions in community crime prevention, providing well-maintained public spaces that encouraged positive recreational use while also creating natural surveillance opportunities that helped deter criminal activity. The park's design had incorporated principles of environmental psychology that recognized the relationship between physical environments and human behavior, with features like good sightlines, appropriate lighting, and clear pathways that supported both safety and recreational enjoyment. As evening deepened and Catherine concluded her walk through the city's neighborhoods, she reflected on the way that urban landscapes served as repositories of collective memory, preserving in their physical features the stories of challenges faced and overcome, of communities that had worked together to address problems and create environments that supported both individual well-being and collective prosperity. The streets she had walked held countless stories that were no longer actively remembered, but that had influenced the character and development of the neighborhoods in ways that continued to benefit current residents. The city had become an archive of its own experience, with each neighborhood, building, and public space contributing to a comprehensive record of how communities could address the persistent challenges of urban life through patient collaboration, thoughtful planning, and mutual commitment to creating environments that supported both safety and opportunity for all residents. The physical landscape that had resulted from decades of such efforts provided a foundation for continued community development and a testament to the cumulative power of individual and collective investment in the places where people chose to make their homes.